Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, Sound. Committee Room 29, Sound. Committee Room 29, Sound. Committee Room 29, Sound.
That she confirmed open now.
Thank you, Clerk, and good morning, members. And we have a quorum, and I now call our meeting here for the Committee for Communities to order. Can I remind everyone in the public gallery that mobile phones must be turned off? Mobile tablet devices can, however, be used through a Wi-Fi connection, and all devices should be muted. Password details are available in the gallery for anyone wanting to connect to the Assembly's Wi-Fi network, and no recordings or photographs may be taken. Can you also remind members then about the protocols regarding the use of electronic devices? Switch all mobile devices to airplane mode and activate the Wi-Fi connection. Use tablet devices discreetly in a way which does not interfere with proceedings, and be aware of the cameras when using tablet device. And I would also like to remind everyone once again about the sensitivity of the microphones here in this room. So item 1 then, apologies. Have we any apologies?
None received.
No. And agenda item 2, chairpersons. There's no real chairperson's business this week, members, so I'll just go on to item 3, which is draft minutes there. And I refer you to draft minutes from the meeting on 14th of March, which are page 6 of the meeting pack. Are members content to agree the minutes of 14th March 2024 as drafted?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Item 4 then, matters arising. Members, just for the purpose of clarification, the table pack was issued again yesterday afternoon because the committee team received a further press release from the department later in the afternoon on that housing issue, the housing conference that the Minister attended. Whilst non-urgent matters are usually held until the next meeting, the press release, which you can find on page 10 of the table pack, relates to housing, and given that so much of today's business is about housing, the clerk, I think, rightly considered that it was appropriate to reissue, so members would have that. So that'll be in your most recently issued pack. Moving on then, members, you have been provided to page 18 with a departmental reply to committee queries on the DFC budget 2024-25. The reply states that the information provides a high-level framework around how the bids can be analysed. Do members have any comments, or are they content to note for now? Yep, content to note, thank you. Members, you've also been provided at page 33 with a departmental reply to committee queries on SR 2022/301, the Pensions 2005 Order, disclosure of restricted information by the Pensions Regulator, amendment of specified persons, Order NI 2022. The reply provides answers to committee queries on whether anyone who is a member of an EU pension scheme will be able to access that information on the dashboards without a reciprocal agreement in place. It also clarifies whether individuals have been made aware of the need for them to expressly disclose information in order to facilitate the pensions dashboard functions, and whether there are any GDPR implications in relation to any of that. Do members have any comments, or are they content to note? Content to note?
Noted.
Thank you, members. Members, page 36, you've been provided with a departmental reply to committee queries in SR 2023/2, the Housing Renovation, etc. Grant Limit Amendment Order NI 23. The reply states that approval to share the terms of reference document has been received from the Minister and are attached at Appendix A. The Housing Executive's private grants remit is to provide grant aid for those works necessary to fulfil an occupational therapist's recommendations. The policy allows for some internal decoration to align with an OT's recommendation. This would include, for example, the provision of a new or to make good an existing bathroom or kitchen floor for safety reasons. Grant aid is only provided to complete an OT's recommendation. For all other home improvement grants, however, neither legislation nor policy allows for internal decorations to be included within the cost of the grant-aided works, except where required in order to protect the works. For example, where timber items have been repaired or replaced. To clarify, there is no grant aid available for internal decoration to privately owned homes other than for safety reasons or to protect the grant-aided works. Members, any comments or content to note?
Noted.
Noted. Thank you, members. Members, then at page 47, with the departmental, you've been given a departmental reply to committee queries on SR 2023-209, the pensions dashboards number 2 regulations NI 2023. The reply provides answers to committee queries on whether or not all government pensions will be available on the dashboard well in advance of the connection deadline. If work can be done in relation to people who may work in the EU but reside here in the North, to ensure that their pension schemes will also be accessible on the dashboards, and also the need to publicise the availability and location of the dashboards to ensure that anyone who is a member of an occupational pension scheme is aware of this service. Do members have any comments or content to note? Content to note, thank you. Members, then at page 50, you've been provided with a departmental reply to committee queries on the Strategic Investment Board Investing Activity Report. Updates for each of the current AMBER projects are set out in the reply. Any members' comments or content to note? Content to note, thank you, members. Moving on then to item 5, correspondence. Members, I refer you to the correspondence memo, page 55 of your meeting packs. So there's one issue I want to just raise in relation to the anonymous letter. It was to forward to Department of Finance for comment. This is on the temporary post, and we have a note in the correspondence memo to forward to Department for comment and to DFC and the Committee for Finance for information. But I think I would like, if possible, to get a response from the Department in relation to the extent to which that practice might be going on and any plans that they might have to address any of the issues raised in the letter. Would members be content with that? Yeah, Daniel?
We're in open session. I'm conscious we're in open session, so how much detail are we able to discuss on this letter at the present time?
You can discuss the correspondence that you've received, any queries you might have around any implications of it. I would advise Chair to move into the closed session.
Well, I think it's quite serious, Chair, some of the allegations.
Okay, well, we'll move into closed. Yeah, we'll move into closed session. We can have that discussion. Yeah.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
We were just in correspondence when that was raised and we moved into close, so we'd need to complete correspondence or any other actions on correspondence.
Okay.
That's you open.
Okay, members, so picking up again then in terms of the correspondence, are there any other items within correspondence members want to flag? Brian?
Just to welcome the extra funding there, 3 million for supporting people programme. I know it's a relatively small amount, but it's an important programme supporting vulnerable people. So just welcome any additional funding for that.
Yep, I agree with that, certainly. Any other issues, Kelly?
Thank you, Chair, and apologies this morning for lateness. The final item on the correspondence is about the individual, about Victoria Square. I appreciate last week at any other business we had agreed to write to the Minister to ask how this would affect. Things have obviously moved on since then. It was just to say perhaps we need to consider on our forward work programme, adding in, because that's going to be an additional piece of legislation that's due to hit through this committee.
Thank you, Kelly. Ciara?
Just on the similar issue, I suppose first of all is to thank the residents obviously for taking the time to draft a letter to us. I do think as a committee we should write to the Minister to the effect on the back of this letter in particular, and I know many people have raised it already, but they urge them in going away to assess whether this can be fast tracked in relation to the transfer from one department to another, in order that we can extend the time period pertaining to the defective premises order within which a claim can be made here, and ensure that homeowners can secure that priority of protection. So I think as a committee, on the back of the residents, it would be pertinent to do that.
Yeah, and I think it is, and I know that while we don't necessarily engage in constituency, this has much wider implications right across, so I think that is important. Okay, thank you, members. Are members otherwise?
Can I check that's a letter to go to the Minister for clarification on the possibility for fast tracking?
Yeah. So members content?
Yeah.
Okay, members. So are members then otherwise content to action all other correspondence outlined on the correspondence memo, including in the table pack?
Agreed.
Yep. Thank you, members. So members, moving to agenda item 6, which is a briefing by the Deputy Secretary of Housing and Sustainability Group. Members, you have been provided with a copy of the Department's first day brief at page 119. And I now would like to welcome to our meeting this morning Mr. Mark O'Donnell, Deputy Secretary, Heloise Brown, who is Director of Social Housing Policy and Oversight, David Polly, Director of Housing and Supply Policy, and Angus Kerr, Director of Climate Change, and Derek Kennedy as well, Director of Residential Building Safety. So Mark, if I could go back to yourself, you're all very welcome to our meeting. Thank you for your attendance. And if I could go back to you, Mark, and ask you to go ahead, or one of your team, to give us a briefing, please, within 5 to 10 minutes, because we do want to get to members' questions.
Okay, I'll go through this as quickly as I can. Well, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. You've had our team introduced. I know you've got the housing executive later, so I thought it was worth saying if there's any issues that you feel it would be useful to have a joint session between ourselves and the housing executive, then we're very open to that, because there's a lot of things that obviously the department has a role and the housing executive has a role. I know you've seen our first day brief, so you'd be glad to hear I won't go through everything in that, but I thought it would be useful just to pick a couple of issues. I'm not trying to be comprehensive, but just a couple of issues from each of the team here. And you've got the entire senior team from the Housing and Sustainability Group, which means I don't have to answer all the questions because these people know the answers probably more than me. But I'll just go through by division. So we'll start with Derek, Residential Building Safety Division. You'll probably know that in response to the Grenfell disaster, DOF set up an expert panel to review the building safety regime in Northern Ireland, and it made 15 recommendations, and those are now the guiding light for Derek's new division. That has been set up. We're taking those recommendations forward, and we hope to be able to publish the roadmap which will set out where we are with the recommendations. Some of them there's really good progress, and some of them we're still turning our minds to. But you're welcome to ask us questions about that. Also, and I know it's a very current issue, the defective premises issue, and very pointedly has come up in relation to the Victoria Square apartments. So, look, I'm not sure if you're all across the background to that. If you are, I don't need to go through all of that, but dates back to 2019 when structural failure was discovered in the building. Scroll forward to just last week, whenever in the High Court, Justice Huddleston ruled that the resident's case was time barred because there's a 6-year statute of limitations on that. Our minister has said, he said this publicly, that DSE will take the lead on amending the legislation to ensure that people here have a set of rights that are similar to or the equivalent of those that in Great Britain that residents have. That was 2022, and the law was changed there. So you'll know, because the three ministers issued a statement. Our minister, the DAERA minister, and the DOF minister met to discuss this. It's going to the executive today, so there's not an awful lot that I can say about that. Just to respect the executive's right to discuss this, but just to let you know, we have very clear instructions from our minister that we're going to have to make this a top priority, and there's happy to answer questions on that as far as we can. On Angus's side, then, his climate change division, it covers the department's work on meeting the statutory requirements of the Climate Change Act, and its work on fuel poverty and the just transition to net zero by 2050. Angus's team leads on the residential buildings chapter of the Northern Ireland Climate Action Plan, and is working across departments to develop policies to reduce carbon emissions. A challenging area, requires change right across our housing tenures to low and zero carbon forms of heating, for example, and we're starting at quite a low base on that, but again, happy to answer questions. I mentioned fuel poverty and the just transition. This is very much who we are as a department. We're focused on the people who suffer most from fuel poverty, low incomes and high energy costs, and the effect on them and their health. Angus might want to talk about the fuel poverty strategy if you're interested in that later. Work is underway on that. There's a set of pre-consultation workshops that are due to commence later this month, just to kind of test out the policies and principles and help us to inform solutions for the forthcoming fuel poverty strategy. Angus's team is also going to be working on the successor scheme to the department's affordable warmth scheme. So, as you know, that was very focused on fuel poverty when it was developed. It now, because of our climate change obligations, it has to address fuel poverty and address the need to reduce carbon emissions. So it's going to have to do two things at once. Eloise with me here leads on social housing policy and oversight. Social housing, as you know, is delivered through the Social Housing Development Programme, and that involves ourselves, the Housing Executive, and registered housing associations. We have responsibility in social housing for setting overall housing policy and the provision of funding for that development programme. We maintain the Housing Association Guide, which provides registered housing associations with guidance on how they develop and procure the SHDP schemes. And a different part of the department, so it doesn't currently sit in my team, but registered housing associations are regulated by the departments and inspected and so on, and that's in John's team, and you'll hear from John lately. There's a budget of 160 million this year. We're hoping to build 1,500 new, or start to build 1,500 new social homes in the current financial year. This is the time of year when we start to worry that we're not going to quite hit that target. I'm glad Eloise is nodding beside me here, but that's something that we want to do. But that's, I think, where we're always arguing to put more resource into the programme, because we'd like to build much more than 1,500 homes a year, but that's subject to budget. One of the major priorities on Eloise's side, and I know we've talked about this to some extent before, the Housing Executives Investment Challenge, so we know the condition of its stock isn't what we want it to be. The latest assessment of that was a stock validation report looking at a 30-year period. It was completed in 2021, so this will not have improved, but it was at that point 10.3 billion. It was 2022 prices projected then, and that's reflecting the cost of addressing the backlog of maintenance that we know is there, ongoing maintenance in stock that's necessary for any social landlord, and the cost of decarbonising the stock in line with the obligations that I've talked about. We have an outline business case developed and a preferred option that we can talk to you about if that's of interest to the committee. Eloise's team also looks after the Supporting People programme, and I know that has been of interest to committee members in the past. That's commissioned via the Housing Executive, 85 different public and voluntary and community sector providers. I think it's about 19,000 clients that are supported through that programme. It's a way, I think, of ensuring that people get the services that are best tailored to them and keeping them out of other public services that are not as good a way of dealing with their needs. So you think of health and justice and the homelessness system and so on. So a really, really valuable programme. Eloise's team also deals with the fundamental review of social housing allocations, which, as you know, there's the housing selection scheme, the common waiting list, which govern the allocation of social housing. It's been in place for over 20 years. It's overdue an overhaul. In 2017, we did public consultation, published the report in 2020. There's 20 proposals there for changes, and we're working through some of those, and happy to talk about that. And finally, then, you'd be glad to hear, David's team on housing supply policy, leading on the housing supply strategy. That's in draft form. It was nearly there at the point when the executive collapsed, and we believe it's in good shape to bring to the executive. I'm hoping to do that shortly. It's a 15-year framework. It's based on a vision and 5 objectives. That would be a good test for David if you want to see if he can remember those off the top of his head. So he's starting to panic now. It's based around a whole system approach. So we know that this isn't just a DFC controlled thing. We know that there are other parts of the public sector and the private sector as well that need to work together. So you think of planning, infrastructure, skills, and so on. You might want us to talk a bit about private rented sector reform, and you'll know that phase 1 of that reform programme was based in the Private Tenancies Act of 2022. The implementation of that now progresses, so we can talk about that in some detail if that's of interest. So things like protections for tenants around the receipts for cash payments and modernising of the legislation limits on deposits that landlords can ask for. We, as part of that legislation, we also had a report carried out on the potential to freeze or cut rents, and that was laid at the Assembly within the statutory timeframe. That also gives us the power to take regulations to improve fire and electrical safety, and an EQIA is being developed to take forward the implementation of those, and then linking as well to the decarbonisation. The bill gives us powers to set minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector, which is one of the places I think needs it most. Sort of conscious of time, Chair, so maybe just mention very briefly, David's team deals with affordable and mixed tenure housing, so things like co-ownership and affordable rent products, intermediate rent I should say. I'd be happy to talk to you about those. We have a concern as well about the levels of homelessness, and particularly there's a lot of detail sitting behind this, I suppose, and I know you're here from the Housing Executive later, and nobody better to tell you about the the detail, but in terms of the numbers of people who present as homelessness, that hasn't seen a massive spike, but the reliance on temporary accommodation continues to grow year on year, and that's hugely expensive, and it's at the point now where we're worried that that the very necessary spend on temporary accommodation is such a drain on the budget that we're not able to do some of the other things that we'd like to in the housing sphere and in other parts of the department's business. So look, there's other things I could tell you about, but I know you're pressed for time, Chair. So if I maybe stop there and just happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, and I know there is certainly a lot to cover, so I appreciate that. I suppose briefly then for me, I've just two now at this stage around, first of all, your overall supply towards the end of, you were speaking of the overall supply. I think I'm right in saying it's gone down from 84,000 average to 83 in the past year. So that's obviously a very negative direction of travel in terms of supply. Is that as a result of right to buy, or do you believe that the department need to be you need to be looking at the right to buy in order to protect that social housing stock?
I suppose that's a decision that our minister might want to take, but there's no doubt that the number of housing executive homes is declining at a fairly well, maybe unsustainable rate because of the right to buy. I think the kind of automatic right to buy has been abolished by most other social landlords, and there's a voluntary right scheme that housing associations can use, and by and large they don't dispose of it. The kind of value for money question there is we sell housing executive homes at a very significant discount, and we know that the money that comes back into the system as a result of that sale is not even close to the amount of money that it would take to build a new social home. The other thing I suppose that will be of concern, and Grania might mention this later when she's talking to you, is you tend to see that the best stock in the housing executives, 80,000 odd homes, is more attractive to people to buy, and why wouldn't they? But that means that the dwindling amount of housing executive stock that there is, and it was at one point in time it was more than double what it is now, is probably more likely to be the stock that needs the greatest investment by the landlord, which goes to the investment challenge that I was talking about. So I think the minister will want to consider whether he brings forward proposals to abolish the housing executive's right to buy. I know this has been on the agenda for other ministers in the past, but I can't prejudge what the minister would say on that.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go to Ciara.
Okay, thank you all for coming along. It's no surprise, obviously, in relation to David and the housing policy strategy. Obviously, we appreciate the work that was brought forward in the last mandate and the work that the department has done on it. And we were well aware that obviously it will be entirely dependent on an adequate investment in the Housing Executive Revitalisation project and joined up cross-departmental working. That's the only way forward on that. Can we get any further detail just on a timeline of just where it's at and the work being progressed on it? And then just a few others, just in relation to notice to quit. Obviously, we attempted it in the last mandate, and the EQIA. Just can we get an update on this and whether there is a means for us now as a committee, given the time period that we have to advance this ambition? Will we be able to do it more effectively in terms of trying to support people who are being given really short notice of periods currently? So just on that, and then just one other in relation to, obviously we're well aware in relation to England and Wales and the new legal standards and in relation to damp and mould, and I know it's an ongoing issue a lot of us have with landlords and the housing executive, and always we must ensure to try and ensure that the conditions in which people live are to a high standard. Can you advise if the department's going to be looking into this and what can be done? And I know the housing executive and Grania's made a commitment with their staff in relation to, it's about looking at the home first and not the tenant, but that's critically important to be listening to the tenants and engaging with them. So just, and on that, just a final one if I can, and I know that I want to let others in, but the tenant participation strategy up to 2020, are we be looking at that? Is that being renewed? Is there further work being done on it? So thank you.
Thanks, Ciara. Look, on the damp and mould issue first, the department has asked the housing executive for assurances around the processes that it puts in place, so that it's aware of the prevalence of damp and mould in its properties, and to give us assurances that they have systems in place that are they're not about stigmatising anybody or blaming tenants for damp and mould in their properties. I think there's a realistic kind of appreciation of that in the housing executive. Links obviously to the investment challenge that we talk about, but that's part of our ongoing oversight of the housing executive. So they do report to us on damp and mould specifically in our accountability arrangements, which I can talk about in general if you like. I think you asked about the progress and timeline on revitalisation and tenant participation strategy, which would be, if Heloise could answer those, and then I'll give David more time to think of your answer on the notice to quit, if that's okay.
Thanks, Mark. And revitalisation, certainly we're moving as fast as we can to get a decision in discussion with Department of Finance and ultimately with HM Treasury on access to borrowing. So we are pushing that work forward, and we have been doing that obviously the last couple of years since the business case. The draft of that progressed. It's still not finalised. So we're hopeful that we will have progress very soon. It is something that has been actively pushed forward. I can't give you any more details really, Ciara, because it will depend on obviously how those discussions go and whether that preferred option goes ahead. But just to reassure you that we are giving it priority. And then on the tenant participation strategy, this is one of those areas of work where we had to look at the resources that we had. So we looked at the work that needed done, some of the other policy areas. One of our policy teams does this, and we have formally paused that work. And that team is now looking at decent home standard. It's looking at a review of the regulatory policy. It's looking at what level of rent is affordable in social homes, and it's had to pause that tenant participation strategy work. That's the department's strategy. There's still a lot of engagement by that team with the housing associations. They're still very confident that the associations have their strategies in place for tenant participation. And we do hear a lot about that at the engagement that they do. So, we're confident, and particularly through the regulator as well, that there is engagement with tenants, particularly on the consumer standard in the regulatory framework. But there hasn't been resource put towards a new tenant participation strategy just yet.
At this moment, is there plans to? Because it's critically important, obviously.
It's one of those things that within the department we would love to be able to do that. If you heard from Colm and our finance colleagues about the level of resource pressures within the department, 600 odd vacancies that we haven't been able to fill last year so that we could live within our budget. Across the four teams that are represented here, we have somewhere shy of 140 staff. We have a number of vacancies, probably upwards of 10%, maybe even 15% of posts are vacant. So we are under a lot of pressure. So unfortunately there are things that we're not able to take forward, and development of the new tenant participation strategy is one of them.
Just on your answers before, I know finally, obviously David's going to go on, just the housing supply strategy. Obviously it's critical, as you mentioned, the levels of homelessness, the levels in temporary accommodation and non-standard accommodation, and we know it's not going to be an overnight solution, but the housing supply strategy and the work that's there and be able to drive that forward. So it would be useful, not for now, as you say, you are working on it, but even having what's the clear actions or steps, so we're more fully aware of what has to be required to kind of drive it forward. And if our timeline, or when a timeline comes, I'd be appreciated. Just to go back to yourself, Mark, regarding the mould and damp and stuff, are you looking to legislate so we can have parity here, like elsewhere? Are we looking at that?
I think one of the things we're conscious of is the fitness standard is quite helpful because it does already make the link between damp and mould that's prejudicial to the health of the occupants. So that's quite old, that's sort of 30-year-old legislation for us, but it actually does make that link formally between whether a home is fit and whether the damp and mould is affecting the health of the occupants. So there is something there that is usable, and obviously we're monitoring what happens in GB very carefully in terms of the legislation they're bringing in. Their regulatory regime is slightly different, but
it will be useful then, even as you're monitoring, to maybe get an update and a comparative. That's asked you where we're at and what's the benefits from the Arab law that we can ensure our tenants benefited from it here.
Are you saying, Heloise, sorry, are you saying that you don't think the department's assessment is legislation is not necessary? It can be done another way?
No, I think we're confident that what we have there, it makes a useful link between damp and mould and the effect on health, which is very important, and that fitness standard is there. We're not saying we've decided it's not needed. That review of the Decent Home Standard is one of the things that will inform what happens for the social sector. And then if the fitness standard is sort of updated again, that standard on damp and mould within it is actually sort of pretty good compared to what's been done elsewhere. We are keeping that legislation very much under review in terms of regulatory policy. We've put guidance out as well to housing associations for how they deal with damp and mould for their tenants, and then obviously, as Mark said, there's the work that the housing executive is doing. So we have been very proactive on it. There's no firm view on whether legislation's needed yet, but we're looking at it.
Brief answer, please, on the rates issue, just so I can get to other members, please, David.
I was going to. You want me to talk about the housing supply strategy or just the notice to quit?
Could I maybe suggest we...
I think housing supply is covered. I think maybe the notice to quit now, if we want to.
Okay, so you'll remember that we made the notice to quit a bit longer, but there was legislation said that once we could put exceptions in place, that it would become longer still. We had a statutory deadline to do that within 2 years. We're not going to meet that. That is in a month or two. We're not going to meet that. We're not ready for that. We did research on it from CIH, which was published and led at the Assembly. We then engaged a bit. So the possible exceptions, and this is about getting the exceptions right to the longer notices to quit. So they are things like large arrears of rent, so we'll need to decide what large arrears are, antisocial behaviour, and then the CIH suggested we would also want, because they're in the primary, then what the CIH suggested we would also want to add one about a family wanting to reoccupy or an owner wanting to reoccupy a house. Somebody had worked abroad or something like that, come back, or their family member wanted to move in. Right. On the antisocial behaviour, it was pointed out that there are issues we need to be careful around in certain instances where one person's antisocial behaviour might actually be an instance of domestic violence or something like that. And we would need to be very careful about how we progress in that. So we're doing a more detailed EQIA to see how these sort of issues could intersect, to come up with a proposal, and we would want to come and talk to the committee about that. Yeah. So when we know what we want to do, and then there'll be the later point when we do need to come and talk to you, because these are draft affirmative regulations that we'll have to come and talk to the committee about anyway.
Okay.
Well, that's great, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Chair. I'll move on to Kelly.
Oh, thank you. Just picking up that last thread, David, I swear I won't torture you today. There's an antisocial behaviour consultation that's out at the moment. Yeah. Will that align with the work that you're doing?
That is social.
That is the social sector, yes. So that's around greater powers for landlords to act for social tenants.
Yeah, okay.
Ours much higher to evict in the social sector because it's a secure tenancy and there's a completely different system around that.
So my own constituency, there's also a barrier to evicting that is created because of the difference that we make between the housing executive and social housing providers, where the data, which could be shared very well and was recently, from the police to housing associations, we're all under the same data protection legislation, should be done, but historically that's only been provided to the housing executive. It would be nice to see that move forward. It's interesting to see that the two pieces aren't run at the same time, but I take it they'll feed into yours then, David?
The fundamental issue of antisocial behaviour as a policy issue is the same. You need to be aware that whereas there's general support for eviction due to antisocial behaviour because of people in the private rental sector sometimes living in the same house in an HMO or neighbours, it really has a big impact on their quality of life. But sometimes, obviously, you need to be careful that you don't evict somebody really quickly. It's actually the victim. You
don't want to have moving away from the review of housing allocations to all of a sudden that it's accusations of antisocial behaviour, whenever it's actually the person who's making the allegation is the person who wants the one out. So I think we have to be careful and quick to that one. Thank you very much on that. There's a lot has gone through today. I just wanted to double check. There's a particular issue that I want to talk about with the revitalisation. Can you just clarify for me the role of the department in the revitalisation piece, because this has been kicking around for a very long time, and there's stuff comes out of the housing executive, stuff comes out of the department. I just don't get how can we get this shifted on, because it has just got to the stage where I think we need to make or break on this. We need to move it forward. So what is the role of the department? Can the minister or can the department at this stage go, right, we're moving this now?
I mean, we can to some extent. We have an OBC that has set out options, and those options have been developed in really close partnership with the housing executive, so we have taken that approach jointly. They're well across it. They have done some of the consultancy that was required themselves. We have done some of it. It's about the legislation is there to allow them to borrow. The borrowing would score on public debt. So it is very much then about talking to people who have opinions about public debt and the right guidance on it. So that's Department of Finance and ultimately the Treasury. So where we can see a quicker route to success will be a minimal change option, because that can just depend on, interpretation of budgeting treatment, or perhaps sort of, looking at how the organisation.
My concern is having a housing authority basically and a landlord all under the one roof. To me, if it was any other business, Monopoly Commission would be and go and catch yourselves on here. It's just, when can we see that sort of movement moving forward? Because the landlord section, I'd love to see more about building and things, but it's the housing authority section, the decision making part.
There's already a very distinct separation. So you could describe it as two organisations governed by the same board, but in terms of how the finance works for the Strategic Housing Authority, what we would call the regional side of the landlord, or of the housing executive, and the landlord side, there's very strict rules that there can't be any cross subsidising. So that's, I suppose, essentially for a very good reason that tenants shouldn't be paying their rent to deliver regional housing programmes that government should be.
I sound very uncomfortable where the decision for where and how and when housing can be built is with the person that has under their same roof their sister or brother sitting next door that's also a landlord potentially that could be building again. I'm very uncomfortable with that. I know the division of duties, having worked in organisations where you have those division of duties and you can have brick walls between things. It just, as a scrutiny person, it doesn't fit well. It would be nice to see it moving forward, one way or the other.
I think maybe the committee should be reassured in that while it's a big social landlord, it's the biggest social landlord by far, obviously, in Northern Ireland. It is an arm's length body of government, so you do have you have levers and scrutiny for the housing executive that far surpasses anything for any other social landlord in Northern Ireland. Just they're accountable through us to the Minister and to the Assembly and to yourselves, obviously. Look, in terms of their ability to strategically decide where housing should be and the sequence in which things should be built, the forward programme is something that there's a fair degree of transparency about, so it's developed every year and published.
I think my problem is that the forward programme is based on criteria that's no longer in date. I see housing developments in rural areas being turned down. The houses will be filled 10 times over, but they're being turned down because the criteria for need isn't being met. If they were built, they would be filled, but the criteria stops them from being built. Yeah.
Look, probably the housing executive would be, they're coming along later on today, and they're maybe better placed to answer just how they assess need. I think it's fair to say that we're trying our best to meet the most intense need, because I don't think we're building anywhere close to the level of new social houses that are needed out there. So I wouldn't push back at all on the fact that there are places that could be doing with social housing where it's not being delivered. But look, I think the housing executive is very good at judging across the council areas what the level of need is there. There are places where there's a shortfall, but there are also places, council areas, where the level of need that's assessed is matched by the level of new social building that's delivered. But I take your point. If you're concerned about how the need is assessed, then it's something you'll want to get into.
The other just
really briefly.
Yes, really briefly.
Really briefly, I need to move.
The housing executive would tell me all day about the operational issues. I have a severe concern. I would love to know how the department's dealing with those people who wish to transfer from the private rental sector into the social housing sector. The body that helps those people is understaffed. The housing executive have told us about that. Operationally, not operationally. Strategically, how would the housing executive deal with, or yourselves deal with that, given the fact that isn't staffed appropriately? Because we're actually pushing people from the private rented sector into the 28 days homelessness, and it's crisis point because there isn't enough staff to deal with their case 3 and 4 months out. Is that something the department's looking at?
I'll maybe ask David just to comment on I can understand the desire of people in the private rented sector to get a social tenancy for lots of reasons, and the security of the tenure, the level of rents, and just all sorts of standard maybe of the homes. I think that's part of the pressure that's on our social sector. So we know that there's 45,000 or so households on the waiting list, about 3/4 of those in housing stress. So, you know, there's no argument that there's a lot of demand for what's quite a finite product. David, are you able to comment on that?
The organisation is the Homelessness Services and the Housing Executive, which is under tremendous pressure at the minute. As Mark said in his opening comments, you know, the number of people presenting and being accepted as homeless hasn't really changed very much at all, but there's a lot more people in temporary accommodation. And one of the sources of that, there's various different sources of that, but one of the sources of that is that at the end of the pandemic, there's a lot of people came out of the private rented sector. So if you're evicted from the private rented sector and you meet priority need, you have your homelessness status and you go into the homelessness system. We're putting a lot of people in own front door accommodation, but they might stay in that for a while. And the length of time people are staying in it is going up and up and up. At the same time, there's a reduction in moving on from social stock, so there's less allocations to social stock. So at the same time, you've got more people sitting in temporary accommodation. You have about 2,000 less social housing allocations every year. So you get more and more people stuck in this limbo land of temporary accommodation, and it's not suitable. It's very expensive. I mean, the department has met this by providing large amounts of extra money to the housing executives to fund this pressure.
My concern is that people are being forced into the crisis 28 days because there isn't enough staff to deal with their case when it was reported and they got in contact to start, which could be up to 6 months in advance.
Yeah.
You know, I know that there's a crisis in homelessness, but we're actually creating homelessness because we're not dealing with the cases. The
lack of social housing allocations, the lack of other options. So we don't discharge the private rented sector either. If people want to go into the social sector, they have to go through that system. Over 90% of allocations to social housing, I think it's actually higher than that, are to people with homelessness points. So if you don't go through the homelessness system, you've got very little chance of getting up a house. So
I think what Kelly's maybe asking for is, what are you doing to address that issue? To prevent the further pressure from building up, and maybe ask you to come back to us on that as to what plans are to deal with that, because I don't think we're going to fully deal with it here today.
Big and long answer that involves building more social houses, building more intermediate houses. And
is there a staffing issue as well as housing issue?
The homelessness service is under incredible pressure because people in temporary accommodation move around a lot, and so you have 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people living in temporary accommodation.
Are you making any plans to resource that?
Yes, so the substantial additional resources have been made. We used to give about £6 or £7 million for temporary accommodation. It's now up around 30, over 32 or something like that.
It's the staff that are supposed to be
that
processing
includes staffing, and Gráinne's comments, she can tell you exactly what's happening, but I can't underestimate or understate the incredible pressure those staff are under.
Okay, and I'm conscious Gráinne's coming as well, and we will be dealing with housing issues. So listen, I have Daniel, Brian, Morris and Walisa. Could have asked you gentlemen just to be really succinct at this point, please. Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, you and your team are very welcome, and we appreciate the presentation. And I'm just going to pull a couple of things that you've raised. One is in relation to challenges within your remit in terms of staffing and the implication and challenges of that. It's duly noted that this committee, it is a matter of concern that we are keeping a very close eye on, particularly throughout the department. And I'm just a specific question without singling out the particular director, but there's one of your directors that are acting in an acting capacity. For what period of time has that been the case?
I'm sure Eloise won't mind me saying that that's Eloise. It's a number of weeks.
Okay.
That's 3 months.
3 months.
Congratulations then, I suppose. and best wishes with it. Just in relation to another point that you'd raised around housing executive stock and the right to buy scheme, obviously this has been a concern raised in this assembly over many years, and the state of the stock under the housing executive as well. You had said that you're hopeful the Minister will bring forward legislation to end that scheme. I've received a letter, because this is an issue I've kept closely an eye on. The Minister had written to me on the 15th of this month, in fact sent 2 letters, one after the other, sent me the letter that he wasn't supposed to send first, which said, "At present I have no plans to bring forward legislation to end the Northern Ireland Housing Executive's house sale scheme. I will consider whether to keep this issue under review as I establish my ministerial priorities." That was all scored out, and the letter that I actually should have received was, "I have no plans to bring forward legislation to end the Northern Ireland Housing Executive's house sales scheme." So this Minister has no intention of dealing with that particular issue. What would be the implication of that?
And I didn't say I was hopeful that the Minister would bring forward legislation. I said it would be a decision for the Minister to whether or not he would bring forward legislation.
Given the challenges that you did outline, and we do appreciate you outlining them because we're very conscious of the challenges faced by the Housing Executive in terms of stock and the implications of a lack of available housing stock for our constituents, what do you think the implication would be of not ending the right to buy scheme as indicated by the Minister in his correspondence to me this week?
If we don't end the right to buy scheme, then tenants will continue to have a right to buy, and the housing executive stock will continue to decline. We would have to keep an eye on whether that effect that I was talking about of the average kind of, if you could use that term, the average condition of the housing executive stock is affected by the better property. So that's on very much part of the advice that we would give to the Minister, and I'd say openly to you. On the other hand, the Minister will have other political considerations. If the right to buy scheme was introduced for other reasons, social reasons that were political judgments at the time, and that would be his call rather than mine, really.
Chair, if you're Mark, am I right in saying that the previous Minister had indicated his intention, or her intention, to bring forward legislation to end the right to buy scheme? I think that was indicated at the previous mandate. Okay, so there's a change of direction by this Minister that is now in place, that has now indicated formally in writing to me that there's no intention to bring forward that. I think the implication of that is going to be significant, particularly given we don't have the investment in this Assembly to replenish housing stock, because we're not going to be building the level that's required, or to improve and upgrade the existing stock. So I do appreciate you taking questions on that, and it is a worrying revelation given what you've told us today.
I'll have to move on, Daniel. So,
Chair, just a very brief question that I have written here. There's been a recent surge in hate crime directed towards migrants in Northern Ireland. What are you doing to contribute to community cohesion in that regard?
We've been very concerned about the levels of hate crime directed towards migrants. We've seen the posters that have been put up in a number of estates, and a lot of those places the housing executive has been singled out. So housing executive, I think social landlords and private landlords have been implied threats. So we're certainly concerned about that. We have been working alongside the Department of Justice in terms of an operational level response. So the statutory partners have a way of coordinating, the immediate response to that. So whether that's removing the graffiti and posters and things of that kind. So there's a way of coordinating that response at the more strategic level. Then TEO have through the sort of good relations lead function that they have, they've brought together a number of the interested parties to see is there something that we can do in terms of a strategic response there to support communities that would actually oppose that sort of behaviour, because I think even though they've been quite widespread, most people that we talk to in communities are absolutely appalled at those expressions of hate crime. And one of the things that we would like to look at collectively, so not just DFC, but collectively, is there a way of supporting a community level response to that? So to make areas more welcoming to migrants who, in many cases, have reached this place after suffering in their own country. So look, there's the TU leads on that, but together with the housing executive, we're contributing to that.
And just this is
no, Daniel, I'm going to have to move. I'm going to have Daniel. Daniel, I'm going to have to move on. No, I'm going to have to move on, Daniel. Brian.
Okay, well, I'll be as quick as I can, Chair. First of all, just to express a frustration often with the slow rate of development of new social housing sites, and engage with some of you on that issue previously. We will continue to push for that, in the Greater Shankill and North Belfast areas in particular, where there are, opportunity sites, but typically it seems to take 5 years, once one phase is done before the next phase is starting. And a frustration that we're told that they can only tend to look at the housing demand just in one common landlord area, when there's demand throughout the area, and just restricting it to one small area And quite frankly, it seems like a delaying tactic to say, oh, there's only a small level of demand here. Through building successful communities, we saw progress in Lower Shankill, Tigers Bay, and I very much supported that, and would support the continuation of that approach of seeing how housing, new housing actually creates regeneration, in disadvantaged areas. That's just mainly a comment. I'll keep fighting for those sites. Secondly, on fuel poverty, climate change, Angus, just the scheme in Ballysillan, Glencairn, addressing the Finlock gutter houses and other houses with only one layer of brick, no fines, I think they were called. The significant, I was in many houses with literally water, you touch the wall, it's damp, wallpaper coming off, ceilings damp. And that ERDF funded scheme has made substantial improvement with the external insulation, new walls, but particularly the Finlock gutters removed. And there is now, we could talk about that all day, but there's now a scheme where we're just going to at least the opportunity, even for the private owners, to buy into and even to take a loan, so they can be part of that Finlock gutters removal. So just to welcome that. I have 3 quick questions. They're all big enough, but I'll ask them briefly. One is about the housing executive itself, developing housing. I mean, Sunningdale now we have a small scheme, which is a low carbon construction method, so it's whether it's just 6 houses indeed, but whether the housing executive having borrowing powers so it could again return to constructing social housing. Secondly, on the high-rise blocks, has there been a rethink? I know you're getting a pushback now in some areas when it was announced that they would all be coming down, but there is a pushback now. I know in Rathcoole people are challenging that, that they don't want to lose the high-rise blocks. So is there a relook at that happening? And lastly, a particular concern of mine is long-term derelict properties that you get in areas where quite often privately owned, but sometimes with housing associations. We have one housing association that owns about 40 currently empty houses in one part of the Shankill, because the state of the properties that they bought, and they say, look, there's damp problems and we're going to have to spend money on these. But you also get properties that quite often maybe they're inherited by somebody who doesn't have the money to fix it up, or they've been repossessed and they belong to some financial institution in London or somewhere. And you get properties that are empty for 20 years, maybe in a row of houses. And it seems to be too difficult an issue. It's a privately owned, so nothing can be done about it. But I feel there's the need for resource from the department or the housing executive to target, and try and find solutions for those properties which are causing misery to adjoining properties, just causing blight and dereliction in areas, and literally 20 plus years in some cases.
If you can, Mark, and maybe some of those
yes,
maybe
maybe
lend themselves to a response. You return to us with a response.
I counted 5 questions there. So
some were just comments. But
yeah, okay. The slow rate of development and the delaying tactic thing, I'll take that, Brian, as a comment rather than a question, because I could give you an answer to that, and I don't know whether you'd be satisfied with it or not. But as you know, I would deny it. The fuel poverty, climate change, and the issue of Finlock gutters. I mean, I know you've addressed that to Angus. There's maybe a bit of a double act in response to that. There is work ongoing. We're talking to our colleagues in the Department for the Economy. Eloise, Angus, I don't know which of you is better placed to respond to that.
On the Finlocks, Eloise.
Yes, I mean, we are working on make sure this Home Repairs Assistance Grant that could, subject to budget next year, could address the guttering. I think it's a much bigger issue in terms of
especially for the private owners, so they can have the opportunity to apply for that. I was more commenting on that, because I think there has been significant progress now. Yeah.
Really need to keep moving on.
Yeah.
Well, would you be content, Chair, if we were to respond in detail on those questions?
Yeah, I think that'll be.
Well, or could we get a brief response on the last 3?
Look, on the last 3, the housing executive developing, the same issue that makes the investment challenge so difficult is what means that the housing executive currently doesn't develop at any scale. So you're right, there's Sunningdale houses, a small number in it. We've been content to fund that on the basis of it's a pilot to learn around things like energy efficiency and so on. If the housing executive was to use its current borrowing powers that scores that the borrowing consolidates onto the department's accounts, and that has big resource consequences for us. So that's why housing associations do all of the development at scale, because that doesn't sit on the department's balance sheet. So look, that's, I'm not an accountant, but that's the answer to that, essentially. So the same solution maybe to the investment challenge helps with if the housing executive was to develop again. So.
And then on the high rise and the derelict properties, maybe come back to us, because I take it those are both going to be come back to us on what they.
Is there a quick answer on the tower block strategy?
I mean, it will be a similar issue, just in terms of what's the most expensive stock to maintain. So it brings in relatively little rent, and it's very, very expensive. And Gordon, you'll be able to talk more about that.
Okay.
Okay, Morris then, and I'm going to release a
Thank you,
brief.
Chair. I'll try and be brief. And if there's any of these things that I ask can be provided, other than by an answer today, I'm happy enough. But it's the impact on your housing build through lack of infrastructure, particularly in the rural areas. And may you now find yourself in a position where it's easier to build in urban areas rather than rural areas where there is still a fantastic need. I know one community in the rural area in my constituency is 54% owner occupied. Young people growing up can't get a house within the community where they grew up because they're all private rental now, and that's a problem I have with the right to buy, Chair, that some of these right to buy houses end up in private ownership and then they're rented out, and that's a loss to the housing executive, and it's also a loss to the community in which these houses have been lost in. The other thing about your upgrade, damp mould, I would assume you're doing an upgrade in heating and ventilation, but could that be tied in with your environmentally sustainable heating projects? I'm talking about condenser boilers where oil is used, or maybe even solar energy where possible. I know it's not possible on all properties. Last one, Chair, you'll be glad to hear, is antisocial behaviour. How much engagement have you had with the PSNI to identify antisocial behaviour and antisocial behaviour at an early stage? Because if it's not dealt with, it quickly sees an area degenerate into somewhere where nobody really wants to go to live. So if you can answer, if you can provide a written, I'm happy enough.
Hey, look,
sorry, one final one. How many incidents of hate crime have been recorded so far? Sorry.
75 by the housing executive in the last 3 months.
3 months? 3 months, yeah.
Yeah, 75 too many. Look, in terms of the lack of infrastructure, and you asked, does that have a particular impact on rural rather than urban areas? It can impact on either. So it depends on the level of, and it's particularly about wastewater connections. So there are parts of urban areas that are now starting to experience a kind of chokehold there. I'd certainly see how in rural areas it's a problem as well. It's contained in our housing supply strategy as one of the most important things that could be done across Northern Ireland to kind of unlock the possibility of development sites. I know that there's a lot more in the strategy than that, so that's the quick answer to that. I'll maybe just ask Angus for a general comment on your point about if we are able to address properties in terms of energy efficiency motivated by climate change, would it help address damp and mould? That kind of goes to the sort of low carbon heating technologies that are out there. And Angus, I'm portraying you as an expert in heating systems here. It's maybe a wee bit unfair, but if you want to just say what you know about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, that's the sort of sweet spot that we're aiming for in terms of reducing emissions in residential developments by improving insulation and energy efficiency, so that the homes are warmer, and then you get the other side of that, the win-win in a sense of actually warmer homes, reductions in damp and mould, and also the sort of health and social benefits that you get with warm homes, where people are much happier, much healthier, able to use their homes much more fully as well, because it even affects children and so on. So we're very much coming at the whole decarbonisation agenda from that sort of side of, you know, the just transition and making sure that the people are benefiting from it in that way.
Thank you very much.
And then finally, is there engagement between the housing executive and
PSNI? Yeah, I mean, there is again quite a suite of work on antisocial behaviour that landlords will do, and the housing executive is the largest landlord, has a lot of detail on that. That might be again be a useful question.
Just have experience of antisocial behaviour taking up to 9 months to deal with, and it causes an immense problem in the whole area.
It's not straightforward because it can ramp up and down. It is very much about having enough tools that will sort of bear down on it and that will encourage people into better behaviours. Yes, as
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Father Overlake, you're all very welcome. My questions, two of them, one urban, one rural, both of them were already broached. And the urban in particular, and I'm thinking in terms of Foyle and in West Belfast and North Belfast, is there any strategy on your part in order to ensure that investment is addressed, we'll say, in those areas of greatest need? And historically that has always been the case, and yet in all they seem to be totally and absolutely underinvested. The second one again too is similar to what Morris has mentioned there about rural development, and in particular use of seriously missed targets there in terms of development in the rural areas. And it isn't, we'll say, just good enough to say that okay, it's lack of infrastructure. It's not only lack of infrastructure, there seems to be a lack of will there as well too, in order to specifically address the need for social housing in rural areas. I make that as a statement, so I should reply.
The areas you mentioned, so Derry, Londonderry, North and West Belfast, probably add Newry into the mix as well, are the areas where we know that there's the highest level of need for new social housing. No pushback on that at all. I think on the delivery of new social homes in those areas, I think that we can provide some figures to the committee, and I think that demonstrates that that there have been genuine efforts to meet that need. And I'm not going to sit here and say that that has dealt with it, because I think those are the areas of the highest and most intense need. But I think we're now in a scenario where you couldn't really pick an area and say there isn't social housing need anymore. There aren't those areas anymore, just for the kind of pressures that we've talked about. We'd acknowledge that we haven't met our rural development targets for a number of years. There's a number of reasons for that. The difficulty of delivering on smaller sites and getting housing associations to bring forward sites into the social housing development programme is one of those. We continue to work on that. Going back to one of the questions that was asked earlier about if the housing executive was able to build again, one of the things that we would be able to do is be more directive about where the housing executive would build. So we're not relying on housing associations and their boards to make decisions to bring forward proposals into the social housing development programme. But I acknowledge that we haven't met those targets.
Okay, thank you, members, and we are significantly over time, but it's been a useful session, a lot of stuff covered, and a commitment to bring forward further information. So I'll just thank you and your team then, Mark, for attending this morning, and thank you very much. Okay, members, we're going to have to move swiftly on to agenda item 7, which today is a briefing by the Deputy Secretary of Communities, Place and Local Government Group. So I'd like to now welcome to our meeting John Smith, Deputy Secretary of the Place and Local Government Group, Tony Murphy, Director, Community Empowerment, Anthony Carlton, Director, Local Government Policy, Gerard Murray, Director, Regional Development, and Sharon Russell, Director of Voluntary and Community. You're all very welcome to the meeting this morning, and thank you for your attendance. John, I'll go straight to you and ask you to make a very brief opening statement, please, 5 minutes, if you can do it, and then we'll get to members' questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the committee members for the opportunity to meet and provide you with background on our group, Communities, Place and Local Government Group. I'll shorten that to CPLG. I'm John Smith, I'm the Deputy Secretary with overall responsibility for CPLG. We have a broad remit spanning social, economic, physical regeneration of deprived areas. We work with the voluntary and community sector and with local councils to deliver strong and effective local government, housing regulation and social policy. We also have sponsorship of several arm's length bodies, the Commissioners for Older People, Commissioner for Children and Young People, the Charities Commission and NILGOSC in respect of the local government pension scheme. The group is a relatively new group. We were formed on the 1st of January 2024, bringing together divisions from other groups within the department, several areas of common objectives, which will enable closer collaboration within the department and more externally. In terms of the budget, typically we have a resource budget of around 117 million annually, and this year our capital budget is 25 million net of EU receipts. I'll just take you through briefly through each of the divisions overall. Urban regeneration, we have 3 offices covering Belfast, the North West, and one covering the rest, the Regional Development Office. They have responsibility for regeneration of towns and city centres, and they do that through public realm schemes to improve the physical environment and create accessible spaces. Urban development grants to the private sector to bring back into use derelict or underused buildings. Development schemes which involve land assembly, revitalisation schemes and the regeneration of key strategic sites. Gerard Murray, to my left, is the Director of the Regional Development Office. They work in 6 of the 11 City Council or council areas, and some of the highlights in terms of Gerard's remit, responsible for 3 projects within the £700 million Belfast Region City deal, in Carrickfergus, Bangor Waterfront and Newry. Also responsible for the proposed Armagh Jail Restoration and Transformation Project as part of the Mid-South Growth Deal, and the Newry City Park Project, which is funded from the Executive's Complementary Fund. RDO also led on the delivery of the COVID-19 Recovery Revitalisation Programme and the Small Settlements Regeneration Programme, and has policy remit for business improvement districts. The second regeneration division is Belfast Regeneration Directorate. Patrick Anderson is the director over that. Patrick's not with us today. And that regenerates central and the greater Belfast area, and it's pretty similar to the work that I've just outlined for the RDO. It's public realm, physical development, also housing-led regeneration with the City Council and the Housing Executive. We also have responsibility for areas around the Lagan side and part of the River Lagan. North West Development Office under the directorship of Pauline Campbell. Pauline's not here today as well. They work in the North West, covering Derry and Strabane, Causeway Coast and Glens, Fermanagh and Omagh, and Mid Ulster Council areas, and with responsibility also for the Ministerial Advisory Group on Architecture and the Built Environment. Again, responsible for a range of public realm schemes in those areas, city and growth deals in Derry and Strabane, and Causeway Coast and Glens. To my right, Tony Murphy is the Director over Community Empowerment Division. CED leads primarily on People and Place, which is the strategy for neighbourhood renewal, and this works across the most deprived urban areas in Northern Ireland, currently funding around £90 million a year, over 300 projects tackling issues around deprivation, health and education, community development and employment. The People and Place strategy is currently under review. We're liaising with stakeholders on a co-design process around that. Part of that review encompasses a test and learn initiatives, which is recognising the need for greater government and other organisation collaboration to tackle deprivation, and we've got 2 pilot projects running in Derry, Londonderry and Auchnacloy. Tony's division is also responsible for social supermarkets and 2 Fresh Start work streams funded by the executive programme to tackle paramilitarism and organised crime. Further to my left, Sharon Russell is the Director of Voluntary and Community Division. VCD leads for the department and the executive really on the relationship between government and the voluntary and community sector, with a focus on strategic funding, partnership and the regulation of charities. The funding primarily through infrastructure support programmes which help in building the capacity, skills and confidence of organisations, staff and volunteers right across the sector. And they do that working closely with local government in terms of independent advice and debt services. We also facilitate the joint forum between government departments and the voluntary and community sector, and through that regular engagement with sectoral leaders we can understand the range of pressures that they're experiencing. A key priority for the sector is the proportionate regulation of charities, and a priority area for Sharon's team is focusing on implementing the recommendations of the independent panel on charity regulation. And over the past year, VCD has also been engaging with the voluntary and community sector on the future policy and funding approaches. We've just finished a public consultation on the future of infrastructure support, and we're working through those responses. We're also planning to consult this year, subject to ministerial agreement, on proposals for a refreshed independent advice and debt service, and also the introduction of a registration threshold for charities. And finally, Anthony Carlton, to my right, is the Director of Local Government and Housing Regulation Division, which comprises Local Government Branch, the Social Policy Unit and Housing Regulation Branch. In terms of Local Government Branch, there are three teams there, responsible for the policy and the legislation which really sets the administrative and the financial framework within which the 11 district councils operate in order to support strong and effective local government. That branch manages the financial support to local government and is also responsible for overseeing the Local Government Staff Commission and the NILGOSC, the Local Government Pension, and the Appeal Service. The Social Policy Unit is responsible for the development of legislative and policy solutions, primarily liquor licensing, entertainment licensing and gambling. And finally, the Housing Regulation Branch is responsible for the regulation and inspection of housing associations, and that includes the Social Development Plan, as well as being responsible for the development and the introduction of a revised regulatory framework. That was a fairly brief run through the broad remit of the group. I'll stop there and we're happy to take questions.
And I appreciate it hardly does service to the extent of the work, but unfortunately time's just against us, so thank you for that. So listen, a couple of brief ones from me and then I'll get to members. You mentioned the neighbourhood renewal consultation there. Is that, I think is what you'd said, that there was a look at that neighbourhood renewal scheme. Is that looking at potentially lowering the population limit at which communities, because I know that has done tremendous work, that scheme, neighbourhood renewal, in my own constituency as well, but I know there's also smaller areas that maybe are locked out of it and could similarly benefit were that to be reduced.
Review's ongoing at the moment, working closely with all the stakeholders and government departments on that. There are a range of things that we're looking at in terms of the measures that we use to measure deprivation. We haven't reached any conclusions yet, and the review's got a fair way to go. As I said, there's a test and learn, 2 pilots ongoing looking at greater collaboration, and we hope to see some results from that in the near future.
I've taken part actually in the Auchnacloy one. It's in my community, that Auchnacloy one. I think that's a welcome initiative as well, to try something new in that respect. The other brief one for me then is around, you'd mentioned the registration for charity and threshold. Is that looking at a specific threshold, at a £20,000 threshold, or what is that looking at?
It is. The review contained 93 recommendations, and I think in our published response that we said that we would, as a department, bring forward policy around the introduction of a threshold set at 20,000. We're developing consultation material for that at the moment, which we hope to put to the Minister to take his mind on that in due course.
Okay, thank you, John. So I have now at this point Brian, Ciara, Melissa, Sean and Kelly. Brian, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and I'll try and cover points greatly. That was quite a presentation, and I've worked in that line of work for many years, both employed and in a voluntary capacity, and I should declare an interest that I'm a director of Greater Shankill Partnership, and I'm involved in a number of groups, but not actually as a board member, but which I would be supporting groups that receive funding from the department in this section. I know an ongoing frustration for groups, and it affects their staff retention, is the length of contracts, and in that review of neighbourhood renewal, people in place, I hope that is something which will receive attention, as I've just seen over the years how it becomes just an ongoing frustration for staff getting their 3-month notice around Christmas every year, and then some deciding to move on. So anyway, I'm sure that is an issue that you will seek to at least provide more stability within the sector. Perhaps comes under Tony's remit. We always like to flag up about capacity building, the need for that in areas where you have a good committed community group. It just makes such a difference to the overall community. We would have in parts of North Belfast, Greater Shankill, areas where there's weak community capacity. They're just it's asking a lot of people, in a voluntary capacity, to step forward and take leadership roles within their community. And there's areas where there's more support needed to develop that. I'm involved in projects like Paisley Park, which is still under the department, where there's very strong community leadership, and it's just a fountain of positivity within that area of the West Circular Road, Upper Ballygomartin. But there's other areas where there's desire to do more, Glencairn, Westland, Tigers Bay, but it's just getting support for the community leadership to come forward. So I would always flag up the need for that capacity building support to encourage people who are making a brave stand in the local area that they want to be community leaders. And just to speak well of the public realm schemes, that was covered in somebody's remit. The one that was done recently in Lanark Way has really lifted that area, and we have some outstanding ones for Lower Shankill, Crumlin Road and Lower Roll Park Road. And I know there's some complications with some of those still to be ironed out, but in fairness, as well as that community capacity building, the physical realm improvements definitely help to lift the area and people's view of their local community. So those are important as well. That's all the points I wanted to make. I don't know if there's any feedback in any of those.
Just all well-made points. I think one of the aims of bringing the new group together is that in terms of placemaking, the physical environment has an overlap to what Tony and Sharon are doing in terms of volunteering community, about making places, improving people's lives, and that's the physical where people live and work, but also in terms of the community development. So hopefully, with a group, that we have now that encompasses all those areas, and again, under the community planning framework, which Anthony's team has policy responsibility for, that can be the underlying framework for which government and other agencies can come together to try and solve some of these issues. You touched on the sustainability challenges funding facing voluntary and community organisations, and I touched on the consultation that's just finished, and one of the strands within that is all around fair funding and sustainability, and recognising the great work that goes on the ground in those areas, and we do rely on those organisations to deliver on our policy objectives, but we are aware that obviously the cost of living has increased and demand for the services provided by voluntary and community organisations has also increased. And I don't know, Sharon, if you want to say anything more about the consultation. Funding.
Brian, it won't surprise you, obviously, that both at joint forum level, where we have that strategic engagement with community and voluntary sector leaders who get elected onto the joint forum, and all of government, every department, Solace, Nulga, are around the table, that approach to fair funding is to the fore. We've developed at joint forum level, the forum has developed, not the department. We facilitate, along with NICFA, a set of fair funding principles to be signed up to by all departments as part of our refresh of that, it used to be called the Concordat, that strategic partnership agreement between the sector and government. And sustainability, longer term funding, settlements or agreements are key to that. So the reason why we are consulting underneath that then around our regional infrastructure support funding, and Tony will be doing the same in neighbourhood renewal, is around resetting that funding relationship. At the minute, as you know, we're rolling over closed funding lines for many years. We have both taken the step of going to 2-year funding agreements for that very purpose, allowing people to plan. A lot of the work that we have to do to roll money forward every year is nugatory. Do you know what I mean? So it's costing us and it's costing the sector money. They're not able to plan and have retention difficulties as a result of it. So we're both in that 2-year sort of funding place now, but we're rolling forward these closed budgets. So we're resetting, I suppose, our funding relationship at regional, sub-regional and community support level over the next few years. We expect the regional infrastructure strand to be recommissioned and re-established from the 1st of April next year, and then we'll go down all of the different sub-regional and community support level strands of funding support that we're putting out. So really, really critical, and it can be done even with where the executive doesn't have 3-year budgets. You can still put out 3-year grant funding agreements with a caveat that it's subject to annual allocations. We've been doing it, and other departments have been doing it, but it's not consistent. And I think that's what we need to get to collectively.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Ciara?
Thank you very much. And just first of all, obviously, I welcome obviously the progression of the £5 million capital works and the inner city walls in the city and Derry, and that's progressing quite, so I welcome that. I would like to have some information just the progress on outline business cases for the city deal, obviously the 3 core ones. So if there's any detail on there, and I recognise Pauline isn't here, but if you could provide that, or if it could be in written form, I would appreciate it. And then just thirdly, obviously I'll declare that obviously I've worked in the C&V sector for many years, core funded by yourselves, and funded many staff through neighbourhood renewal, so I appreciate that work, but I'm conscious that since 2009, it was 1-year contracts, it was cuts, it was efficiencies. Tony, you mentioned the 19 million, and then obviously Sharon, you had mentioned about a 2-year deal, about resetting the funding formula, because we're well aware regarding full cost recovery never took place. I'm just conscious that, and then likewise I'm also aware of your pilots, your test pilots, the one in the Diamond, and I've spoken to organisations and individuals. So I'm conscious we can evolve, we can change around the models and structures, but simply it's been cuts and it's been efficiencies. And I wouldn't like to see a process where it's about cuts or how you realign a budget, because it's not about cutting or going to new areas or different areas. It's about increasing the budget, and I'm someone there constantly reiterated it. The budget has been cut to the bones within our communities across the north. Neighbourhood renewal, fantastic strategy, but cross-departmentally it didn't work. The departments didn't come. We need a statutory remit where other government departments obviously come around the table and work with the range of partners. We had some willing partners, but they didn't bring money to the table. They took money from the table. Great work. I know there's a lot of work needs to be done because we didn't track the performance and the great work that was done in neighbourhoods. So I know you have been ongoing, and there's an ongoing review. All I'm really trying to emphasise that there's some amazing work done through the neighbourhood renewal strategy since 2007. It's constantly been under review. There's amazing work. I'm not too sure you need any more tests and pilots, because the work's already there on the ground. It's about building from the inside out. It's about building the partners in them neighbourhoods, in them communities, working collectively together to deliver for the people, because they know best what the people need. And it's about additional money. It's not taking money from areas to move it into other areas. So that's my hobby horse. But obviously that's just the 3 areas. The city deal, it'll be really interesting to find out more about that. And just overall regarding the budgets for particularly the likes of programmes, neighbourhood renewal and working in our communities, how do we add to that? And likewise regarding ensuring, as our previous minister done, which was strongly welcomed after 13 years, that staff working in the community voluntary sector were actually able to pay their staff an increase last year. Is that going to continue? Is there money in the budget to guarantee that those working in the C&V sector can get a fair pay next year and the following year?
We'll have to do very brief responses.
I'll take the city deals, yeah. The Derry and Strabane city deal. So council is anticipating the signing the financial deal spring, early summer of this year, and that's subject to approval of the subsidiary business cases coming through. So in terms of the 3 constituent parts to that, we've got the Strabane Town Centre Regeneration Project, we've had the OBC, outline business case for that, in December, and that's currently going through the review process within the department. The Walled City Regeneration Project, that's the £15 million scheme. We're the lead department on that, and we're hoping to get the business case from the council by the end of this month. Then there's the Derry Central Riverfront Project, that's the £45 million scheme. The business case has been developed for a revised scheme on that one, and we look forward to receiving that as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Tony, neighbour funding, investment.
Funding challenge. In terms of where we've been at the funding, we were able to protect the funding, the neighbourhood renewal funding in 23-24 when other funding pots were being cut. Take the point about the challenges faced by the sector. We did provide a non-consolidated uplift to salaries, £1,925 in 22-23. Last year things tightened down again. We were able to secure additional funding to help with lifting up the national living wage and matching that. So appreciate here where that is in terms of terms and conditions. In terms of the cross-departmental working and the elements around neighbourhood renewal and what people would see as failings of the original strategy, that's part of what Test and Learn is about. We've got a cross-departmental steering group that has been together now for about 18 months, and that is looking at how we can address deprivation in a more collaborative approach, firstly amongst government departments, and that's what the Test and Learns are around. They're identifying the barriers to why we cannot do things better rather than looking to make cuts out of a neighbourhood renewal budget.
Yeah, thank you. Melissa?
Fáilte Overleg, you're all very welcome. Again, to come back to the Staban Town Centre Public Realm project, and I know there's been different sort of iterations in relation to that project, and there's with Casework Committee now, I think it is, yeah. But can you be any clearer just in terms of what's the total cost of the project? And secondly, when is it likely to be delivered?
It's a £7 million scheme, the Strabane Public Realm. I was out there a few weeks ago, and Pauline and the team walked me around all the streets and the areas where the work's going to be done. And it will link into the City Deal project, which is more just outside the centre a wee bit. Yep, casework was yesterday. I don't have an update on how that went, unfortunately. Once it's cleared our casework committee, because of the scale of it, it will need approval by the Minister and then DOF. And obviously, as with all of these things, the Minister will want to consider what he can and can't afford within the whatever capital budget envelope he's given. So we do need to get moving on that one if it's going to happen, because the planning permission expires in April next year. So there's no reason why we can't move within that time frame, but there's a few steps to go through just yet.
Thank you.
And sorry, just one additional question as well too. In relation to the risk support grant that previously the Derry City and Staban Council very much depended on, is there any indication that there'll be anything else put in its place?
The rate support grant is it's a statutory grant that we pay to those councils that qualify for it. The amount is discretionary, and it's not ring-fenced. So the Minister will consider the level of rate support grant when he gets his budget. We're committed, or the Minister's agreed to do a review of the rate support grant just to make sure that it's still meeting its original aims and objectives, and we look forward to working with district councils on that as we go forward. Anthony, is there anything more to add on that?
Yeah.
I'll try and rattle through these quickly. Ciara got in before me on city deals, but it was just, even if I can get a written update on the Causeway Coasting Glens growth deal, doesn't need to be gone through now. The criteria for the £1,500 cost of living uplift, I was just wondering if there was a criteria that was kind of put out for those. I think it was 257 organisations that got that £1,500. I'm just wondering how they were decided. And if we can get a bit of an update on the DFC elements of the the paramilitarism and organised crime. I'm really particularly interested if there's any DFC element that is looking to protect children and young people from risk of human trafficking and risk of exploitation, and whether there is an input and the test and learn elements of that cross-departmental working. Is there anything that's being learned that can be applied to that? Because it is such a huge piece and body of work that I think has to feed into lots of different departments. And I guess that's where the frustration from the sector, especially the youth sector, has been, that it's very siloed working, and that's been to the detriment of, unfortunately, the young people at the centre, because it's very much compartmentalised. Then I think this might still be you, Tony, sorry, is the access to food. I visited the Mid and East Antrim Community Hub and their affordable food club a few weeks ago, and they were saying basically that they still hadn't heard about next year's budget, which then obviously their staff are on protected notice, and that scheme is incredible, absolutely incredible. It is fully subscribed, they're beyond capacity, and if you're ever in, it's the tiniest wee room, and what they do in that building is wonderful. But I guess stability of funding is always key, but I think particularly when there is such a ripple effect and such a huge amount of people within the community that are benefiting from all of their services, just wondering whether there are any, I suppose, stability for funding those social supermarkets and affordable food clubs, and
yeah, that's it.
It's good.
Yes,
I tried to do it as quickly as possible with no preamble.
There we go. I'll deal with cost of living uplift. That went to all organisations that are funded through Voluntary and Community Division and Community Empowerment Division. So those are the organisations that we have a funding agreement with. Silo working youth sector, I think that's around our test and learn and trying to develop a framework that then can be transferable across whatever the issues might be. We're looking at deprivation in rural and urban areas, but the ultimate aim would be to come up with a framework, a collaboration framework that would be applied where there are cross-cutting issues. Access to food, budget. I don't think anybody would argue against the incredible results of the social supermarket. I mean, the wraparound services speak for themselves. Yeah. It's people who need support, but committing also to the wraparound services, and the evidence is that makes a huge difference. So it does. I mean, there's over 3,500 people have been through the social supermarket model, which is, so positive, yes, budget dependent.
And the one on trafficking, there's one on trafficking there as well.
That's kind of factors into the test and learn.
Yeah,
Jared's going to tell me all about in a letter, aren't you, about the Causeway Coasting Glens growth deal.
Look at that to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, please. Thank you.
I'll just keep on that wraparound, but Sharon, sorry, I'm going to come to you on this. We were recently, and I'll declare an interest, Chair, I'm an ILGOS pension. Will be a recipient, so just to declare that at the start. But I know Sharon and I were very recently at an AGM of Citizens Advice Ards in North Down, where there was the discussion about debt services. And Tony, you've just mentioned there about the social supermarkets and the wraparound care. So my question is about, we know that we have Make the Call, and we know we have the Independent Advice Service and the debt service. I'm quite aware that, and I've said this before, I use Make the Call to find out what benefits a person's on, and then I'll go to the Independent Advice Service for the wraparound stuff. I'm just wondering, as part of the review that is going forward, will there be an opportunity to look at the differences rather than the duplication of the work of the two?
Great, thank you. Kelly, yes, it won't surprise you that there is obviously duplication in the system, and there's probably, being honest, a wee bit of tension in the system too about why does the department put £2 million odd into its own advice service, and yet there's an independent advice service. And the difference is the person who way back in 2011 set up Make the Call is when you talk to Make the Call, they have your benefit profile sitting in front of you. You can't really beat that. But obviously there's a role, we believe, for both. So when the former minister established that review of advice and debt, it's significant money. It's more than half my budget in VCD if you take out the 3 ALBs. So if you think about the money going into the sector, I'm not making any judgment around it, but it is around half, and sometimes with fluctuations more than half my entire budget goes into advice and debt services. So there were 3 reasons around the review. One was to look at the infrastructure support that the sector needs to deliver, especially the people delivering on the ground. The second one, this is a really important one to the sector, if you're listening to all the people operating these wee small advice services that are so critical in our communities. The second one was to rebalance our investment. If we're honest, we certainly the former minister didn't believe that we had that balance right between the money we're putting into support, training, infrastructure above the delivery, and then what's going out to the actual delivery. Wanted that turned around a wee bit, and that the evidence for that is so strong. We've been out, as you know, for the last 12 months consulting and co-designing this new delivery framework with representatives from the sector, with local government officials and Section 75 partners. So the third thing obviously was to remove duplication and improve access through aligning services. So Tony talked there about social supermarkets. It will not surprise you that we have made that connection in the department. So when you were out the other day, there were Make the Call people there, weren't there? Or were there benefit uptake people? And obviously we have advice and debt embedded into the models. As I said last week when we were out at Ards in Northdown, there is an increase in funding for debt for next year, and we said, Kelly, very openly, we're working with partners to see what we can test. I funded some research in the women's sector around take-up of debt advice. We're not reaching the people. We said that. And it's not for want of trying on Advice NI's part. I'd give them that. You just look at their social media. But we aren't reaching people, and we aren't reaching women. And we have money. Ring fence money, it can't be put anywhere else, and it's significant uplift coming that we are trying to work with partners on the ground to see what can we test over the next year. We're looking at the violence against women and girls strategy to see, there could be people in abusive relationships afraid to leave that because of the debt implications for themselves, stuff like. So it ties in with the collaboration work. All of us might need debt advice at some stage. This isn't always just about, there's an assumption that advice is all about people and benefits. It really can affect us all. There's about 180,000 people in Northern Ireland this year that will be in problem debt. Our surveys would tell us, no, it's about 12% of the adult population. But so there's a lot of room for new work there, and we think the review will start to bring some of that together.
Mm-hmm. Really brief.
The other one was, it was mentioned about the Concordat agreement being reviewed. My concern is that inside the Department for Communities, we can have the Concordat agreement and everybody understands that, and once you leave the Department for Communities, nobody else is paying any heed to it. Is there any work being done or can be done to get that cross-departmental buy-in?
Very much so. So, as I said, the Joint Forum has around 15 odd members from their leaders at CEO and other levels in the community sector, and then every government department, usually at grade 5, sometimes delegated down, but not often now. We have had, I think, for the first time in many years since COVID and COVID recovery, we have consistent attendance at Joint Forum by directors across departments and in local government. And there's a commitment, Kelly, there, I honestly see it, a commitment, and dare I say it, a passion for trying to make sure that whenever we agree this time, that beyond lovely statements and commitments, and we can use all that language, we've used it many times before, but we're going down a level to say, what would departments signing up to those commitments of shared values, how we'll engage, how we'll work together, how we will do fair funding. So there's funding principles, and underneath that, how we can demonstrate that, because the sector quite rightly is saying to us, like Denise Hayward, chair of, or CEO of Volunteer Now, is my co-chair, we co-chair it, and she's saying, you know, how this time do we make sure it's done? How do we police it? You know, so there has to be an accountability framework around it this time.
Okay, thank you for that. Actually, I was minded while you were speaking there, Sharon, about the need to get support out to people, about the pressing need for an overall anti-poverty strategy, which obviously is something that does need to be heard. Listen, thank you again. As similar to others, we could have spent another hour with you, to be quite honest, because there's so many important things within your brief, but time is pressing across such a vast department. So thank you for your briefing today, and we'll move now, members, directly to the next session. And this next briefing, members, is a briefing by the Housing Executive. And you will have a copy of a briefing paper from the Housing Executive there at page 178. So, we will now welcome to our meeting, just give the committee staff a moment.
Panicking and comparing answers.
Delay?
Not sure.
Go ahead.
Glasses.
So delighted to welcome to our meeting this morning, or this afternoon as it is now, members. I should point that out. Grania Long, Chief Executive of the Housing Executive, and Jennifer Hawthorne, Director of Housing Services. So, Grania, could you please go ahead and make as brief as possible opening statement, as I would like to maximise time for members to get a plethora of questions, which I'm sure you will deal with admirably.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your time. So, yes, I mean, we've sent through a detailed briefing and very, very happy to take questions as you're ready. And I think, you know, from our point of view, the Housing Executive is a unique organisation. I always say it's one of those organisations, if we didn't exist, someone would invent us, because it is the housing agency for Northern Ireland, the Strategic Housing Authority. But what makes us unique is the fact that we have a very large public landlord, so 83,000 homes, about 6,000 leaseholds and commercial properties. So that makes us an important provider of public services, obviously, a police shaper in terms of ensuring that land is brought forward to enable new build, the commissioner of the new build programme, of new build social housing. As I said, a really important, and I would say this wouldn't I, but a trusted public landlord, and our customer service outcomes show that. But we're also a very important economic driver. So we spend 1.3 billion a year in our local economy, and importantly in our communities. And we're a problem solver, and that's as we should be. So given the range of services that we provide and that we fund, and a partner, makes us a really important organisation. And housing is infrastructure, it's social infrastructure, it's environmental infrastructure, it's economic infrastructure. In terms of our functions, and I won't go through them, Chair, I absolutely understand, I'm very happy to discuss them, but I think what's really important is that we are an independent assessor of housing need. So the ability for Northern Ireland to have an organisation that captures all of the data that it needs to, in terms of assessing what is the scale and the nature of housing need, right down to a local level, really puts us in a very strong position in being able to take an evidence-based approach to housing and to new build social and affordable housing, and that is very important to us. I think it is worth commenting on the fact that projections in relation to new build social housing are up 73% since 2015. So in other words, in terms of our needs assessment, the number of new homes that we need, we are seeing an upward trend, an ongoing upward trend since 2013 in terms of the numbers of new build. And the 5-year projection for social and affordable housing is 24,922. Now that number is really, really important for a number of reasons. It's the number that we use to advise local councils when they're putting together their local development plans and their planning policies. It's a really important figure because it informs the social housing development programme and the new build. But it also then enables us to direct housing associations. We cannot compel housing associations to build in a particular place or a particular locale. They are independent organisations. But what we can do is give them as much information on the homes and on the schemes that we would support. But there's been an overall reduction in allocations of new social housing and of social housing generally. So at the same time as seeing very large levels of demand growing, we're seeing a reduction in allocations. And that's because there's less churn. There are fewer housing executive homes. If I was presenting to you 10 years ago, we would have a much, much, much higher stock than 83,000. We still sell about 500 of our own stock every year. And so a combination of all of that and new build not keeping pace with demand, as I've said, means that there are fewer allocations, and that is why we have a waiting list at the level that we have. And you have the waiting list figures, and I'm happy to share them. So I suppose before I finish, and I've covered just a tiny little sliver of information there, but what's really, really important now is that we bring forward a new housing strategy is brought forward, and I think that housing supply strategy really has to focus attention across government. Housing is not just an issue for one department. I'm sure you're very keenly aware of that, but that across government we take a focus now on housing supply that sees housing as an economic driver, sees it as a really important social asset, and also understands the environmental impact of housing. I think we need to see an investment strategy now that prioritises housing, but that also ensures that it's not just a solution for one department, that we understand that infrastructure has to be built in a much more aligned way. We tend to fund infrastructure separately in Northern Ireland. It needs to be funded in a much more aligned way. And I'll finish just by saying our role as the Strategic Housing Authority and Landlord is to get on and do. We are a delivery organisation, so the questions that you will ask, Jennifer and I are happy to answer, but we will always be focused on what can we do to deliver, what are our outputs and our outcomes, and I suppose that's why housing professionals go to work, why we enjoy our job so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So actually, I'll just make this as a comment, although it would be a question I would have maybe at a later stage, but that stock also needs to provide adequate and appropriate disabled access housing and the concept of homes for life. So if our Department of Health are increasingly looking to care for people at home, then we have to have the housing stock that would allow them to do that and allow easy adaptations. We've talked about OT at the early part of the meeting. Two quick ones from me then. I'm going to go back to the one, and I asked the department here when they were here earlier around the, and given your own comments, Grania, and you'd said, I think 553 homes sold last year. And I think an indication in the earlier session that the Minister wasn't overly minded on that right to buy. What's your assessment of the need to address that right to buy so we don't see houses going off at this end of the social housing while we're still not up to speed on the input end?
Yeah, so social housing and public housing is a public good, and our job is to safeguard that housing for today's tenants and for future generation of tenants. And so what is important about a public good is that we cherish it, we nurture it, we invest in it. And so, a huge focus of our attention as a landlord is to ensure that we invest in our homes. We will invest 280 million in our homes in the next financial year. That's just been approved by our board. And that's paid for from rents. So rent pays for services. And as a landlord, we have effectively one source of income, and that's rental income, and that's brought in every year from paid by tenants. We spend a lot of time, effort and energy in ensuring that rents are paid and that we support tenants who have concerns about their rents. But once we have that income, then we invest it in one thing, and that's back into the homes and the service for our tenants. So if we have a smaller stock, then that obviously means less of a public good. And I think all of the evidence from other jurisdictions shows that unless you replace like for like, so in other words, when you sell stock, that you replace it entirely like for like, which is rarely done, then what you are doing by having a right to buy or a house sale scheme is fundamentally depleting a public asset. And ultimately, it is always the case that tenants in the best homes want to buy. So this is not a value judgment on the individual tenant who wants to buy the property. It really is about how we fund a system of public housing, and we are depleting that stock. And I suppose final point I would make is ultimately the solution to our investment requirements, which all of you know about, the gap between what we have and what we need has grown over many years. The solution to that is to enable the organisation to borrow against its rental income. If we deplete that stock year on year, you're depleting an asset base against which we need to borrow. And again, the people who the negative implications of that are on today's tenants and future tenants, the people on the waiting list.
So reading what you're saying, you do believe that right to buy is an important part of the solution?
I think either suspending or moving away from right to buy is a really, really important, will have to be a really important focus for the future.
Okay, thank you. The second and final one from me then is on the rural housing, again touched on in the earlier session. Only 71 new social units started in rural areas 2022-23. Appreciate there is a steering group with a specific focus on this, and I come from a rural area myself, but in terms of trying to identify hidden need within rural areas, and it is often hidden, people just don't bother applying sometimes, and all of that. What's your current assessment in terms of the level of need in rural communities, and also if you and you can provide some of this to me in a written response if you think that might be easier, in terms of what impact the lack of wastewater infrastructure is having in rural towns and villages, and the final part of that question around emergency housing accommodation in rural area. What stock do you have by constituency? And I would like that one in written form.
I'll follow up in a lot more detail on all of that. But rural housing and the need for rural housing is a huge priority of ours, and we have a rural housing strategy for that reason. But I think just looking across that 5-year housing need assessment, you can look, and we break this down right down to local level. So I'll follow up in ensuring that you have that the committee has that in terms of understanding the scale and the nature of housing need. I think one of the reasons, and when we speak to colleagues in our place shaping teams, some of the reasons that we have not seen the growth in rural housing that we would like to see is land availability. Another reason, of course, will be the primary deliverers of social housing in Northern Ireland for the last 24 years are housing associations, and housing associations are independent organisations, so they will make decisions based on their own risk assessment as to where they build, and some housing associations for whatever reason have not built in rural areas, some do a fantastic job, by the way, of building in rural areas, so there is a gap between what housing associations intend to build and what is needed, and so our needs assessment really tries to focus everybody where need is, but we cannot direct and we cannot compel housing associations to build, and there is no other delivery model for new build social housing, and so I think what we need to see in the future, and again we've talked about this at length as an organisation, is as a public landlord, what we would like to do is to be able to use some of our land to build in rural areas, and to be able to do that over the coming years. So I think that's going to have to be an important solution in terms of new build. The impact of wastewater infrastructure is without question now having an impact, or lack of wastewater infrastructure is having an impact on new build. But I think it is distinct in rural areas, and that's because of the nature of wastewater infrastructure and how it works. So I think I'll follow up with you directly, and I'll understand more from our place shaping teams in relation to that. On temporary accommodation, and I'm sure we'll come on to homelessness in more detail, the trends and the growth in homelessness, and in particular need for temporary accommodation, has meant we've moved very quickly. We've had to move very quickly across all council areas to acquire. To lease, I should say, temporary accommodation. And there are some parts of Northern Ireland where we have had to lease temporary accommodation for the very first time. And in fact, when I travel to all of the council meetings once a year to present on our housing investment plans, we do that in the autumn, I've been really surprised in the last year in particular by the numbers of temporary accommodation that we've had to lease in areas that we never had a presence in terms of temporary accommodation. Believe it or not, that's actually easier in some areas. Where the pressure points are in terms of accessing temporary accommodation are in urban centres, because it's just the market doesn't allow for it. We've been able to access temporary accommodation by and large where we've needed it in rural areas. We'll come on to budgets and the budget and so on for that. But I mean, it's not lost on anyone, and it's not lost on local councillors that we are using temporary accommodation in rural areas in some places for the very first time.
Thank you, Grania. So I have Maurice, Kelly, Brian and Andy at this point. Maurice, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and I think you've asked all my questions. Are you reading my page? No, you've answered some of the things that I have actually written down here about the hidden needs within the rural community and how you hope to address that. But have you found that some of the land availability that you would identify in the rural area isn't actually available at all because of the lack of infrastructure? And 27,000 households on the waiting list, and the cost of temporary placing, including hotels and B&Bs. What are your plans to increase temporary accommodation whilst at the same time reducing dependency? on temporary accommodation. It's a kind of negative question I'm asking you. And the other one, average rent for the Northern Ireland Housing Executive property is 79-80 quid a week. How does that compare with the private rental sector, and is that sustainable? And the other one, if I could have a written information on the outcome of your housing needs test in the Causeway Coast and Glens. One comment, with your permission, Chair. Tree planting. I was a rural dweller, just like the chairman over here. I'm really impressed with the tree planting schemes that takes place in rural housing, and I would like you to continue with that, because it's not only environmentally friendly, but it makes the whole area aesthetically pleasing to the eye. So, there you go. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Morris, yep.
Thank you. Well, look, tree planting is something I feel very passionately about, and we all do. And so, yes, we have exceeded our target last year for tree planting and exceeded it extremely well, and we want to continue to push on that. And you're right. And actually, what I should say is I'm really encouraged by what I've seen from our tenants. I think, again, if you went back 10 years ago, trees that were too close to your house were sometimes seen as a slip hazard, and people didn't always understand the impacts of greenery and the impact it has. I think now people understand they are they have a cooling effect in the summer. Shade is becoming much, much more important. They are a flood defence, and people understand that. And when we talk about trees and tree planting, we're also talking about hedges, and that has an impact in terms of just giving people a little bit more privacy. So we've tried to work really closely with our tenants and our residents to understand the really positive effect that tree planting has, and it has a lovely effect on the local economy. There are companies that work with us who also we are creating jobs in relation to that. On land in rural areas, it will depend on the council area that we're talking about, and so land will be more available in some places more than others. I'm very keen that we, through community planning partnerships, that we work really closely with ourselves, councils and other public sector landowners, and we've seen in the last few years, I think, the very positive effects from community planning partnerships. So Newry, Morn and Down, we've seen some brilliant examples of other public sector landowners working closely with us, with local housing associations, where a piece of land is brought forward or is derelict and needs to be built on. And I think there was one in Moylinny in Newton Abbey, again, where it was actually local residents who brought it to our attention. We were able to look on the public trawl and see it come forward. We were able to express an interest for that site, and a housing association then built homes on that site. So there's some really good, I can give you lots and lots more examples. So it will depend on the area, but I think as and when community planning continues to grow and improve, and I think Belfast is a prime example of that, but many others are. I think we'll see much more of that kind of land and land assembly and land partnerships, and I'm very keen that we do that. On temporary accommodation spend, so I think just to be very clear about the need for temporary accommodation and why we've seen temporary accommodation grow so much. So pre-pandemic, we were placing about 3,000 households a year in temporary accommodation. The pandemic hit, and a whole generation of people who were hidden homeless, to whom we had an obligation to provide temporary accommodation, but for whatever reason didn't need it. When the pandemic hit, they suddenly did need it, and they needed it very quickly. So everybody had to choose their bubble, and we all had to find a solution. And so our placements in temporary accommodation went from 3,000 a year to 10,000 a year in a very short period of time, and they have continued up. And the reason they've continued is because after the pandemic, we then had an economic shock and we had a cost of living crisis. And so a different cohort of people came to us seeking temporary accommodation. And they were people impacted by the cost of living, the rising cost of living, but also people who had lost their home because landlords were leaving the sector. So we definitely saw an increase. So that was the second group or wave of households that required in increased numbers temporary accommodation. More recently, we've seen a continued growth in both of those groups, but in particular a continued growth from households who have arrived in Northern Ireland and sought leave to remain and had been granted leave to remain, and we've seen a growth. So all of that has led to a huge growth in the need for temporary accommodation. It's not unique to Northern Ireland. When you look to Scotland, Wales and England, we're seeing similar impacts. So our temporary accommodation spend, just to give you an overview of this, and we can follow up, and these are publicly available data, but if you look back to 2018, 2019, we were spending 5.7 million on temporary accommodation a year, and then that rose to about 14 million in 2020-21. So within 2 years it rose to 14 million. Last year it was 23 million. And we think at the end of this year we will have spent 35 million on temporary accommodation. So that is a phenomenal growth. to be clear, in Northern Ireland, we have an ongoing duty to provide temporary accommodation. So when a household comes to us and we undertake an assessment and we award full duty applicant status to that household, we provide temporary accommodation unless and until we have found them with permanent accommodation. So that is unique to Northern Ireland, or relatively unique to Northern Ireland, that level of protection. An unending duty. And so there is a reason our temporary accommodation spend is as high as it is. It is not just that we award temporary accommodation, but that is an unending duty. And I started today by telling you the length of the waiting list. So until we find a social home for that household will stay in temporary accommodation. Now, we've done a number of things, and so we're also problem solvers, if I can say that. And so when we began to predict forward what the numbers would be like, it was not our view that we would simply keep the system the way it was. So we said we would do several things at once, which we've achieved. One of them is to ensure that temporary accommodation is own front door accommodation. The majority of our stock for temporary accommodation is a single let. So to the household, in terms of the quality of that accommodation, we like to keep it as close to a secure or a flat. We like to keep it as close to what you would get if you were being allocated permanent social housing. So of the numbers we've about 3,200 units of temporary accommodation right now, and about 2,700 of those are own front door accommodation. Okay. And we visited them, and they are high quality. Now, the rest aren't. The rest are a combination, but some of those will be because the household needs ongoing on-site support. Okay, so within that. That adds to the cost, but the real cost, as in the cost that we are really concerned about in relation to temporary accommodation, are the numbers in hotel accommodation. And that is 5.5 times the cost of those own front door flats. Okay, so all of our focus has to be on, if we're going to drive down that budget so that we can spend it on prevention, because fundamentally that's what we want to do, then we have got to keep pressing down on the numbers in hotels. And I suppose the other group that we took a decision on 3 years ago was to ensure that we do not place children in hotels other than in exceptional circumstances and for short periods. So again, unique to Northern Ireland, the number of placements, the percentage of placements in temporary accommodation, in hotel accommodation, that are children is 1%. So while we don't want to be placing any child in a hotel, any homeless family with children in a hotel, to keep it at about 1% compares very, very favourably with other jurisdictions. So hopefully I've given you an overview as to why the budget has grown. Since November, we've focused specifically on those numbers in hotels, and we've worked really, really hard to increase our temporary accommodation portfolio, and we've actually managed to lease an additional 80 properties, which is good news for 80 families who will not have to spend time in hotels, and we will continue to do that. So we are constantly out in the market looking at that. This week, for example, we our own executive team, which takes place every week, we approved a new approach to kind of longer term leasing of stock, temporary accommodation stock. So we're not quite at the whim of the market. But I have to say, and I've said it to all party groups and previous committees in the Assembly, we're not going to move away from those numbers anytime soon unless and until we have a step change in supply of new build. And we know that's the solution. And I suppose the final point I would make is credit to the department, because throughout this process we have needed an increase in budget, and that budget has been met, and that was very, very important that we're able to do that, because we have to meet our statutory obligations.
Okay, thank you, Grania. And Maurice Kelly, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Grania. Grania, it would be really helpful if we could say, I know you say that you used independent evidence-based approach to deciding where new builds or social housing will be. Would it be possible to get a copy of the criteria that's used for that, and when was the last time that was updated? The other thing, just that's a request for that in writing, if possible. Can I also ask if it's possible to get an update on the Disabled Facilities Grant? I know that changes have been made to the grant, but it's very difficult to sort of track what the improvements have been or what the changes have been. Is there anything that we could get as a committee to say Disabled Facility Grant sat here in, say, 2016, and this is the changes and the improvements that have been made, and what else is planned for that? The last thing, just to ask, so I'm being very quick now, is
Thank you, Kelly.
we have spoken before about the difficulties that there are when people are changing from private rental into asking for social housing, and that there's been issues with recruitment within that division that looks after those people. But can I just ask as well, the housing transfer application form, and this ties back to what the chair was saying earlier, that form asks for a person's obviously their name, address, who would be living in the house, their marital status, their racial group, their religion, but doesn't ask disability. And I just wonder, is there an issue there that it says that the information needs to be collated for monitoring purposes, but not all the Section 75 groups are being asked for in that? I'm just wondering what religion, because religion doesn't, it actually says on it, they don't want to base anything on political opinion. Is religion being used as an assumptor for political opinion? And it's just why disability wouldn't be included on that. It maybe isn't something so specific as that to be answered today, but if that could be looked at and come back just to explain why disability isn't included on that form. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So on your first question, absolutely. So we have a very complicated approach to assessing housing need, which you'll be glad to hear we'll not go through today. And also the technical experts are within our Strategic Housing Authority team. But essentially, I suppose the key point to make is there are a number of indicators of housing need. And I think oftentimes people assume that the waiting list is should be the primary indicator of housing need, and interestingly it's not. There are lots of other indicators of housing need beyond just the waiting list, and that's because of how the waiting list is made up. So it's 45,000 households on the waiting list, and the vast majority of those are in housing stress, but some of the people on the waiting list live in existing homes and are on the waiting list for other reasons, for a new property and so on. So we use a complicated method to do that, but it is internationally peer reviewed, and we've just reviewed it actually in terms of the looking at it. Later this month we will publish the commissioning prospectus. I will send that to the committee, and that sets out how the methodology that we use, the criteria that we use, and what the findings are. So if I send that to committee, and I'm very, very happy, my colleagues I'm sure will make themselves available to the committee if you'd like us to brief you on it, because it is so important that we have an independent evidence-based approach to housing need, and that it is down to a local level, so that the public can understand what we mean by housing need, that they can understand when we talk about need in their community what that need is, and what our most up-to-date version of the model now enables us to do is to assess housing need across tenures. And that's really important too, because councils want to build on a multi-tenure basis. They want to build social affordable private rented accommodation in their area, and it's really, really important that we're able to give them the data to inform that assessment. So that's what
confuses me, because there's so many of the councils don't have local development plans in place at the moment, so it's how we're getting that identification.
That's right. So for those three councils that have LDPs, that SHMA social housing market analysis has been key to that. But I'll send the commissioning prospectus to the committee, and then I'm very happy for colleagues, maybe if it's helpful, to come in. Yes, we've undertaken a review on disabled facilities grants, and I'm really pleased that has been strongly informed by our tenants and our residents. Our Housing Community Network has effectively co-led that work with us, and so if I follow up directly through the chair with the committee in relation to where that is at and where the review is at, and the improvements that will be made on that. Are you happy to cover the issue on housing transfer?
Yeah, the all housing forms, we collect data in order to fulfil our equality legislation data gathering requirement. I think it's a really good question, and I'm going to come back to you on that one in terms of the disability, because certainly we record information in the housing assessment in terms of disability, and you'll know the points in terms, how we're doing our totalling up the number of points dependent on the circumstances of each individual. There are points that are attracted because of physical disability, and also all forms of medical needs. So that's reflected in the points. But it's a really interesting question you've asked there, because the Section 75 groups, there's a range of groups that are not fulfilled in that. So let's get back to you on that one, because maybe we were asked at the time to give it in a particular format because of housing and its complexities, but we'll get back to you on that.
We appreciate
You've made me think about it, to be honest, Billy.
Yep. An excellent point is right. Brian?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Grania. Jennifer, good to see you here at the committee. Just to commend the Housing Executive as a public sector body, I have to say I've always found it to be very accessible. Even though at times we will have battles over issues, in fairness, we'll always come back, you know, and work with myself and staff. I might briefly duplicate some stuff I mentioned earlier to DFC officials. Just a frustration with the slow rate of development of opportunity sites, and we will continue to highlight those. There certainly is land availability in Greater Shankill, North Belfast, and to flag up, I'll maybe write to you separately about Glencairn, where there's particular opportunities. You know, there's a desire to create a village centre there for that long cul-de-sac estate, you know, which needs a heart to it, and there's good opportunity sites there, and we'll continue to push for that. Two specific questions. One I raised earlier about long-term derelict properties, which is a frustration. I mentioned earlier that, you know, you get properties even 15, 20 years that maybe been inherited by somebody or repossessed by a financial institution, and if they're quite often attached to other properties people are living in, and it's difficult to get any public sector body to do anything because they're privately owned, but they need attention. They just bring blight and misery for those that are joining. And my other question is about, it's mentioned from time to time whether the housing executive could return to being a developer. And I know there's the small site you're doing at Sunningdale, 6 properties. You know, would there be any advantage to that in terms of the number of social houses that could be developed? I know the housing associations do a good job themselves and have a high standard. Do you think it would actually make any net difference if the housing executive was able to develop itself?
Thank you. So on opportunity sites, yes, I mean, I think, and it's been mentioned already, I think it's taken council's roles as in terms of community planning some years to now get those partnerships in place, but I think we're in a really good place. I would see it as probably one of the most positive opportunities locally to enable sites to come forward. So that is where you have the council, ourselves as the Strategic Housing Authority, other public landowners like the Education Authority and so on, sitting down together saying what's the scale of housing need in this council area? Where are the opportunities? Where are the sites? We undertake routinely, we undertake site identification studies where we will go out and we will proactively look for sites, and we'll make it available to, you know, we will work with, as I say, other public sector bodies in terms of where land comes forward on the public sector trawl for land. So I think there are real opportunities there. I think the next bit is then when local communities want to use those sites and bring them forward for development, and I think that's probably where we still have more work to do collectively as public bodies about not just managing local expectations. I mean, I think it's wonderful, by the way, at how many local groups now want to see housing built in their local area. It wasn't always the case. Sometimes people wanted other things built. I think everybody recognises now the scale and the nature of housing need. So I think there's probably more that we need to be doing collectively, not just the housing executive, on what do you do when the land has been identified, so that we are prioritising, because who goes first? I mean, you know, we've got all of those councils, we've got housing need everywhere, and so we're doing a piece of work at the moment, just kind of rationalising our process internally so that we're clear what are the criteria you would use, where you would fund that one over that one, for example, and all of this has to be based on housing need, and I know you know that. So I think this is it's an exciting and an important time, I think, for where opportunity sites emerge, and I'm happy to come back and talk more about that. In terms of long-term derelict properties, I mean, I agree, and in fact, only recently we've used our vesting powers in relation to a derelict site in Belfast, as it happens, where there were, I went out to see it myself, and there were 2 properties at the end of a terrace, and they were derelict, and there was 1 property left, and it was just, it was an eyesore, and we were able to use our vesting powers, but it's incredibly complicated, and understandably, there is a very high test and a very high bar that we must meet, because vesting something is a very, you know, it's and rightly so, an onerous legal process, because it is a very important thing to do and to get right. So we will always look at that, and we will always look at opportunities to vest. But what will happen in that situation, that brings me on to answering the third point, is where we exercise our powers in terms of vesting, the land usually gets transferred if it's going to be used for new build, and if housing needs supports that, it will be transferred to a housing association. So that brings me on to your third question in relation to what difference would it make if the housing executive were to build. We have commenced a new build programme, as you said, of 6 homes. I was really struck actually when we made that announcement, and it is a pilot, so it is the first time we will have built to pacify standards, so the lowest standard carbon output, using modern methods of construction, and we wanted to be a blueprint for social housing. And when we announced that, I was really positively taken aback by the number of people who wrote to us to say, why is this not happening in our area? And I thought, well, that's music to our ears, because frankly, we need homes built everywhere. So I would like to be undertaking new build in every council area. I'm sure everybody would want me to say that anyway, and need supports that. What difference would we make? I think first and foremost, we don't want to and we shouldn't replace housing associations, because then we'll just end up with no net difference, and why would we do that? So we have to add, okay, so how does the housing executive then, as a landlord, ensure additionality? Well, that would be using our own land. So I suppose, first of all, it would mean housing executive land being used for new build, and that's a public asset. To go back to my point earlier about using public assets for public good. It would enable us to build our capacity in terms of that, but it would also mean less grant is necessary, because one of the aspects of housing association or grant for housing associations currently is that the grant funds two things. It funds the land, the site itself, the purchase of the site and the land, but it also funds the cost of the build and the staff and as in the skills associated with all of that. What we would be looking for would be works only HAG. Works only grant, essentially. So the land is an asset that's ours to use. So I think that helps to answer your question around where the added value would be. It would be better value for the public purse. But just to be really, really clear, that is not intended to be put forward in any way to replace housing associations. It will be of no benefit to the public if we replace housing association output. We need that to remain high, and we need to grow ours at the same time.
Very quick supplementary. Those new houses in Sunningdale, I assume they'll not have right to buy. Then
it's a very good question, and it's a question that we are looking at right now. Right. It is a very live question. So I think my truthful and honest answer would be, my view would be that they should not. They are, they've been built with essentially grant public money. They will be high spec, they will be one of a kind, they're hugely important that we do this. I'm very excited about it, and I think we need to be very, very clear that, in my view, a personal view, that this is an opportunity now to reset that. So I think this is an opportunity to do that. So we are undergoing those discussions right now.
Yeah. Thank you. Andy, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chair, and I'll be brief. I know we're under time constraint. Grant, you're just jumping back to your answer to Brian, and obviously you'd highlighted on it would be the vision to build on the Housing Executive's own land. Can you maybe touch on the scale of that land, how much land the Housing Executive currently has?
Yes, I'm very happy to follow up if that would help, just to give you the detail on that. And so we have significant land holdings, although they have diminished over the years as we've transferred that land to housing associations for new build. And so there's a piece of work ongoing at the moment where we are looking at if we were to be granted those powers and have the opportunity to do it, where we would start. And that, first of all, goes back to the first principles of housing need. So the land that we would use would have to be in areas where need supports it, would have to be our own land, and it would have to be developable land, because what was interesting about Sunningdale Gardens in Belfast, it's a corner site, it's readily available, access is relatively easy. We could get on site speedily because it's our land. We didn't have to spend a lot of money on remediation costs for the land. So I think where we would start is, if you take a similar set of criteria, where would you identify maybe the top 10 or the top 20 sites if new build were to come, opportunities were to come sooner rather than later. But I think I'd also be very keen, I started off by saying we shouldn't be doing things separately. I'm about to write to councils to seek meetings with chief executives to see where the opportunities are for a much more integrated approach to sites, because what I would really like to do, if we identified our, for example, top 20 sites, is then layer them alongside where are the other opportunities that maybe other public sector bodies had, be they councils, be they other public arm's length bodies. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we were to sit down and say, right, instead of doing one small site that's the housing executive site, let's do some place shaping here, let's get it right, let's build homes alongside other forms of social infrastructure, and we would have to then also ensure that we have the wastewater capacity to do it. So that's why we need to be a bit more aligned, and why I keep coming back to where community planning is a real opportunity to do this, and where we've done it already and we can see real results.
Yeah, and part of my follow-on question then, Grania, is based on part hypothetical. Obviously, let's say in the coming weeks we were to get good news from Treasury as part of the revitalisation. What is the new build readiness of the Housing Executive? How quickly could you move to start building on that land then?
It's an excellent question, and it's one that has been in our corporate plan for the last 2 years for exactly that point. And so the readiness is good, it's strong, we know the land, we know the sites we'd like to start on, and we've, as I say, commenced the build in terms of the 6 new builds. So I think we would, without question, be in a position whereby we could move relatively quickly, and we could move, I should say, quickly in relation to do that. I think to go from an organisation that hasn't built for 24 years to a point where we would be really ramping up the numbers beyond 100 and 200 a year is going to take some time. But I mean, I'm very confident, and I wouldn't say it before this committee if I didn't think that we were in a position to do that. And we have been building our capacities, I suppose, to be in a position where we're ready to go.
Thanks, Rania. Chair, I've quite a number of other questions, but I'll ask one more because I know we're due to meet in the coming weeks, Grania, as part of our ongoing engagement that we have regularly. So in terms of recruitment, and I know we've heard ourselves about the challenges that the department themselves are facing around recruitment, but what about the housing executive? Are you facing any recruitment challenges? I know I've seen difficulties within the housing advisor team, for example. Could you maybe talk to that a wee bit?
Yeah, if I speak generally, then Jennifer, you'll want to talk about specifically. So, I mean, I think it's been challenging for everybody, and in terms of ensuring that we have the kind of skills that we need in the organisation. There's 3,300 colleagues across the housing executive, and it's a really multidisciplinary organisation. So everything from architects through to advisors and finance colleagues and everybody in between. We stood back about 2.5 years ago and said, what are we going to do about it? And let's put a plan in place. So we have spent a huge amount of time looking across all of our roles, looking at the areas where we have specific kind of challenges in terms of recruitment, and we have I suppose modernised a number of roles. We've done some restructures in terms of making sure that we have what we need and that we're clear what our workforce plan is. And we have then targeted our recruitment. So we've used social media much more. We've been much more proactive in terms of how we've described roles. Some of our roles just simply, we were using kind of language to describe roles that was putting people off. We've gotten much better at talking about the advantages of working for a public sector organisation. So it's not just your salary, but it's your pension entitlements, which is really, really important. And I think a combination of all of those things has led us to a much more successful recruitment programme. We are oversubscribed for most of our roles now. About 3,500 people applied to join the organisation last year alone. So we've had, a real upturn in terms of the numbers who want to join. And that's music to my ears. The Chief Exec, we want the best people. We want people to see the housing executive and housing generally as a brilliant profession to work in. And so I'm really pleased with what I've seen. And a third of our staff have joined in the last 5 years. So that gives you a sense of it. That said, there are particular roles that are challenging to recruit to and retain, and that's because of the nature of the work. And if I hand over to Jennifer just to talk about our housing solutions roles and housing advisor roles.
You'd be delighted to know that actually, as we are sitting here today, the interviews are ongoing for our Belfast vacancies in housing solutions. Obviously, it's housing advisor role is a critical role because it is the ones that are dealing directly with the most vulnerable in our society at a crisis point in their lives, when they are homeless and coming to us, and therefore any vacancies within that service hits us very hard in terms of our desire and need to be able to provide an immediate service. So interviews are underway for the Belfast vacancies. There's a wider recruitment drive that is nearing completion for outside Belfast as well, and we've been really encouraged by the numbers of applications that we've had. So I would like to think that we will be some way to addressing those vacancies in very specific roles. Maybe if I put a time, 3 months, I would say. We are well down that road, very encouraged by people applying. It's a fantastic job. It's one that you want to. You're really making a change to people's lives, and we're seeing people that are wanting to come and work with us. And we'll keep that recruitment up because it's ongoing, because the churn and the turnover and the volume of the staff that we have. So it's not just fixed in time. It is one that it's an ongoing recruitment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andy. Moving on to Ciara, please.
I'm conscious of the time, so I'll try and be really, really quick. I suppose, first of all, housing supply strategy. Obviously, we want to see the revitalisation of the housing executive. That's actually crucial. So I'll be interested, has there been any conversations with yourselves and department officials and the new minister in relation to how that can be progressed? Secondly, obviously, we're well aware that Foyle and North and West Belfast and Newry are key areas have the highest levels of housing stress in the area, and I have to appreciate and thank the staff in the housing executive working quite closely, particularly in Foyle and in Derry, with a range of partners to try to tackle that and reduce the number of those in temporary accommodation. So just on to that, and in relation to just the homeless prevention budget, what is required moving forward? We couldn't have it last year. What's the thoughts this year? Because as Grania, as you've mentioned on many occasions, we need to turn the shift to early intervention and prevention, because we are in a housing crisis, and it is good to have the glass half full and do a lot of work. But if the housing executive's not back building again, and if we don't increase the social housing development programme, it's an evolving circle. So I'd be interested to hear any movement on the Homeless Prevention Fund and what funding could be allocated to that. And then just finally, is there any update on the Craigan Heights refurbishment scheme in relation to the Department of Finance and the business case? I know I have wrote in to the Department of Finance and they give some feedback just where that's at. And have we any timeline as to when the to and fro and back and forward with the business case will be finalised and we can progress that refurbishment? So thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of revitalisation and you know, and the ability of the housing executive to borrow to do two things: to invest in our stock and to build. I mean, progress has been made, and I have to say progress has continued to be made, and I'm really positive and optimistic that we will be in a position to do that. I know Treasury discussions are going on. We have certainly fed into those discussions in terms of ensuring the department has the information it needs to do that, and I'm certainly very pleased to hear, you know, Minister being very clear that it's his intention that that work will progress. Okay, so I think there's a huge level of consensus, and I'm really grateful for that consensus across all of the parties, but also just generally speaking, I think just in terms of what it will mean for the construction industry, but most importantly for our tenants, actually even more importantly for the people on the waiting list, because this is about additionality. It's not just about investment in our existing stock, but it is about additionality. So I suppose the key questions that are going to be in front of all of us on this is, you know, can the housing executive borrow, should the housing executive be allowed to borrow, but with public funding being the source of that borrowing? Okay, so in other words, that would enable the housing executive to retain as a public organisation without the kind of structural change that would be needed. It would mean you wouldn't need to change our tenancies, for example. You wouldn't need to change the status of the organisation to become a housing association. It would remain a public landlord, and you wouldn't need any structural change in terms of the size of the organisation. I think there's a general level of consensus that is the approach. A public body remains a public landlord remains a public landlord and borrows from public sources in order to do that. So I think that's continued to be the narrative around this, and I'm pleased to see that. But I think fundamentally it will mean enabling us to borrow, giving us the powers to do that without it counting against the block grant. But then we come back to the point about rents. Okay, so rents, you know, a lot of people look to Vienna as the great source of fantastic public housing, which it is. But what marks Vienna out is that when it builds its social housing, its public housing, it says that rents must keep pace with the level of investment that's required in its stock. So in other words, when you get as a landlord to a point where your rent income is decoupled from the cost of investment, then you're in trouble, and that's what's happened to us. So again, I suppose rents have increased. Our rental income has not kept pace with the cost of investment. So those two decisions will have to be made at the same time. Should the housing executive be allowed to borrow? Will the source of that borrowing be public to remain it as a public landlord? And then what should the rental trajectory be over a period of time to enable us to invest? So progress is ongoing. As I say, Treasury discussions are happening, and I'm pleased to say that you know, as I say, we've certainly been involved in that, and the noises are very good. And just to give you the gap, I mean, in terms of our rents and inflation. So rents have increased by 20% since 2015. CPI has increased by 32% since 2015. So there's a 12% gap. And as I always say, it's really simple. I'd love to pretend that, you know, this is really fancy stuff that we do. It's rent pays for services. Landlords bringing income, and we spend that income on our tenants' homes, and that's what our tenants want. So we will have to get to a point where rent covers the cost of that investment, and that's really, really important. But I think our tenants know that, and they understand it. And I was asked the question earlier, it didn't actually answer, about rental incomes in the housing executive compared to the private rented sector. But just to give you a sense, our rent currently for our average weekly rent per property is £74.24. So that's per week, okay? And so multiply that by 4, and that's your monthly rent. And monthly rents in the private rent sector in Belfast are £850. So there's a huge gap. But I don't think you're comparing like with like when you compare our rents with private rented sector rents. The comparison really is our rents with housing association rents, and housing association rents are well above £90 a week. Well above. In fact, we're approving much higher levels of housing association rent. So I think and our tenants know that. Our tenants understand that. They understand that by keeping their rents low, what we're doing is we're not investing in our stock, and they are paying for the cost of that in higher energy bills. And we can talk about other issues like damp and mould perhaps on another day. If I come back to the point around prevention, just to answer your question, so we have been very, very clear that to get away from the kind of investment in temporary accommodation that we have, to get to the point where we are investing heavily in prevention, will require a turning of the tanker, exactly as you've said. And we have submitted a bid to the department next year in terms of our revenue funding, which assumes a significant investment in prevention. But as it currently stands, if we were to have a funding arrangement next year, pretty much as a baseline, so going from this year to next year with no increase, then our bid currently in relation to revenue funding to fund everything that we think we need for next year is 184 million. If we were to be funded on an as-is basis, we face a deficit of 39 million. So our funding for next year would be, on an as-is basis, would be 145 million. So we're facing a funding deficit going in to next year in terms of the Strategic Housing Authority, and that funds our supporting people budget and our homelessness budget and all of the other revenue requirements. So I suppose the final point I would make on prevention is it's not all about funding. It's not all about funding. It is also about structurally changing how we think about prevention of homelessness, so that we have much more joint partnerships with health, with justice, with education. I would love to be in a situation where we talk about homelessness openly in schools. We need teachers to understand and to be trained and to be resourced. So this is not about getting them to do more work, absolutely not. But we do need a situation whereby teachers understand and are trained to see the signs where a young person looks like they've been moving house. Or they're coming in and they're talking about living in a hotel, and so are we escalating that so that people understand, or that and young people talking about risks of homelessness? There are lots and lots of ways that we can do prevention differently. I think we haven't had a moment to catch our breath, either as an organisation or as a sector, and we couldn't do what we do. The voluntary community sector organisations who do phenomenal work. I would love to see a really strategic approach to prevention where we all step back and say, what can we do together? I know every penny we spend in housing and all of the decisions that we've made to keep children out of hotels, we've done it because it's the right thing to do. We've also done it because we know it saves education budgets. If we hadn't made that decision, children would be moved every week and would be moving from school every week. And the fact that we've been able to keep children out of hotels has had an impact on the education budget. So I think that kind of strategic approach is needed. And I think there's a question I didn't answer.
Reagan?
Yeah. Oh yes, I haven't had, so very quickly, I haven't had an answer on the business case.
Just to confirm on that, we are engaging and responding to the economist questions in terms of the business case. So we're very hopeful on progressing it through and providing the information back in a very timely manner.
Is there a timeline, estimated timeline, based on where you're at with the Department of Finance now?
The questions have been answered, and we are hopeful, but we'll wait and see the answers, whether we've addressed all the queries.
Okay, Daniel.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Grania. Thank you, Jennifer. Grania, just put on record my appreciation to you and the wider Housing Executive team for the huge level of queries that you get from my office on a weekly basis, and for the hard work your team do to help us service our constituents. So we do appreciate it very much. We're under no illusion as to the challenges that are faced by the Housing Executive, and we're very clear about what they are for some time. There was a discussion earlier with representatives from, members of the Department for Communities, and we had a discussion in relation to the Right to Buy scheme. What is your particular view of that scheme? Well, I'll just ask what your view of that scheme is first of all.
That has been covered already.
Is it? Sorry,
Daniel?
well, it's just,
yes.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. We'll cover that. In terms of the waiting list, 45,000 families on waiting lists, which is significant. Each of us, if we're in about our constituencies, and indeed from people who come in, they tell us on a weekly basis, of homes that are lying empty across various council areas. They're being used as addresses. What actions have the Housing Executive taken to curb the level of accommodation that's been used as addresses but isn't actually occupied across the housing stock?
That's a really important question, and I'm sure you're very aware that housing executive voids are the lowest in the sector. So in terms of any vacant properties that we have, we get those let and back out again, so that they can be tenanted, and we target those tenancies for people who are in temporary accommodation to make sure that we get people out of temporary accommodation as quickly as possible. So our voids are the lowest across the landlord sector, in fact across these islands. But with regard to tenancy fraud, as I would call it, we have a very robust response to that. So very happy to provide you with the actual figures around that. So when there is a process that we do, if we have been told that someone is not living in a property, or that someone, if you remember the old saying, a gyro drop, a brew drop, and we have a very, very strong response to those properties, or to those cases that are brought forward to us through our tenancy fraud investigation. That is not just done by our local office, but also through further and more rigorous investigation as well. So we would ask anyone who thinks that there are such properties within their area to come to the local housing executive office, and we will do everything we can to investigate that and to make sure that the properties are being fully occupied. And we have recovered quite a number of properties through that process.
Figures in relation to that?
We have, and we're very happy to provide those. They're part of our process.
That would be helpful. Just I note the point that was made earlier, Grania, as well, about the difficulty in building houses in rural communities. But there's a knock-on effect to an absence of that investment, and that is the closure of rural schools and local amenities in rural areas. In fact, in a constituency such as the constituency I represent, and Belisha, their rural communities are the heartbeat of our entire constituency, and the absence of that necessary investment has a very detrimental knock-on effect to our communities. So we would like to see significant improvements in that regard, and I suppose any advancement that can be made in seeing the development of housing in rural communities.
Can I just answer that point to say, at the moment we are a facilitator and an enabler. I would like us to be a doer in that respect. We cannot use our own land to build, and we cannot compel housing associations to build, and I don't think we should, by the way, that they are independent organisations and they should be. But I think the gap there is that we in Northern Ireland don't have a public body that can step in, where there will always be, in any housing system, there will always be areas of housing need where for whatever reason somebody hasn't delivered housing. And I think when you have a strategic housing authority that's a public landlord, that's a particular role that we can play. We tend to step in where no one else is providing, and we get that that's our role and we're happy to do it.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Grania and Jennifer, thank you very, very much. I have to say, I think it comes across really, and there's no question we could do entire sessions on housing alone. But I think there is merit here in looking at how we get the housing executive back doing what it does well to address the need that is out there. And I think the housing executive well placed. So thank you for a really good session, really direct answers and good succinct answers, and I promise to bring back further pieces of information which we appreciate as well. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Okay, members, going now to LCM, item 9, consideration of the committee's report on the legislative consent memorandum on the pensions special rules end of life bill 2024. So members, the draft report is there at page 198. You've also been provided with Marie Curie's evidence to the committee at page 208. We will go through the draft report section by section, and that's the formal consideration before the report is ordered to be printed. So, okay.
What's left is from behind.
Oh, okay. So members, so I'm going to go through a number of sections here and just ask members to give me their indication. So I refer members firstly to the section of the report on powers and membership, which are paragraphs 1 to 3. Are members content with those?
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, members. I refer members to the background section of the report, which is paragraphs 4 to 15. Are members content?
Yeah.
Thank you. And I refer members to the evidence from Marie Curie section of the report at 16 to 20. Are members content?
Yeah.
And then I refer members to the committee consideration of the bill and the section of the report, which is at paragraphs 21 to 42. Are members content?
Yeah.
So then, members, just before I finalise our consideration and put the question, can I refer you to the clerk's memo at pages 11 to 12 of the table pack and check that members are content for a sentence to be added into the report referring to Mary Curie's call for an amendment, acknowledging that whilst the committee was made aware of it, it did not form part of the scope of the draft memorandum in relation to which consent was being sought. Thank you, members. Members, that concludes the committee's consideration of the draft report. So I'd like to put the question now that the Committee for Communities orders the report on the legislative consent memorandum on the pensions special rules for end of life bill 2024 to be printed. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Members, agenda item 10, SR 2024-51, Guaranteed Minimum Pensions Increase Order, NI 2024, page 211. Members, any objection to this rule?
No.
Thank you. Then I put the question that the Committee for Communities has considered SR 2024/51, Guaranteed Minimum Pensions Increase Order, NI 2024, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, has no objection to the rule. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Agenda item 11, SR 2024-52, Social Security Revaluation of Earnings, Factors Order, NI 2024, page 219. Have members any objection to the rule?
No.
Therefore, can I put the question that the Committee for Communities has considered SR 2024/52, Social Security Revaluation of Earnings, Factors Order, NI 2024, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, has no objection to the rule. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Agenda item 12 is SR 2024/54, the Social Security and Universal Credit, Migration of Tax Credit Claimants and Miscellaneous Amendments, Regulations, NI 2024, page 230. Have members any objection to this rule?
No.
Therefore, can I put the question that the Committee for Communities has considered the Social Security and Universal Credit, Migration of Tax Credit Claimants and Miscellaneous Amendments, Regulations, NI 2024, and subject to the Examiner of Statutory Rules report, has no objection to the rule. Are members agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Agenda item 13, Forward Work Programme, members, a copy of which is provided at page 244. You'll also find at page 14 of the table pack a clerk's memo which summarises where the committee is at this point in terms of taking initial briefings and requests for information from the department in preparation for the strategic planning session in May. I'd like to thank the committee, the clerk and staff for that. That's a very comprehensive capturing of where we're at and very useful in that sense. The memo reminds members of the need to remain cognisant of the must-do parts of the committee role when considering the possible topics for committee focus in a strategic planning session in terms of bill consideration and the delegated legislation. In advance of our planning day on the 9th of May, members, we would ask you all to consider at an individual level what your top 5 priorities list might include and advise the clerk if there's any further topic on which a briefing could be sought in advance of the committee planning session. So what's members' thoughts on that? Go ahead, Kelly.
Could we, or are we going to get from the Minister a list of his legislative intentions? We know that he's talked about a few things, but we don't know what all's coming through because that will impact on what we can actually achieve.
We have a request in for that, clerk, don't we?
We've asked the Minister to confirm that, and it's the executive that have the actual legislative programme as such, so it's whatever the Minister has submitted, his submissions to the executive for inclusion. So we're hoping by the 18th, when the Minister attends, that could be firmed up. I have made reference to those bills which officials have referred to and the possibility of something around defective buildings, but there's no definites as yet.
If we get into that, Chair, then we're into the rabbit hole there. That's when we go off. This committee before had plenty to deal with, and that's when we are weeks of.
Yeah, and it is clear. I mean, it is clear that that is going to be a massive, and you know, already there's the whole Victoria Square, you know, on top of the 3 that we know are coming. So there is going to be a heavy schedule there. So we will have to be very, very strategic and defined in terms of what it is we want to achieve. So. Can I also ask members that, just moving on to our next meeting. So our next meeting following Easter recess, which will be on the 11th of April, that meeting is going to put a further focus on housing. So we will have, as well as neighbourhood renewal, we'll have the neighbourhood renewal forum, We'll have the NI Federation of Housing Associations. We'll have Homeless Connect, Housing Rights and Chartered Institute of Housing. So that's another focus on housing, and appropriately so, given the session we've just had. Members, any comments, or happy to note that? Okay, happy to note. Agenda item 14, any other business? Sian, you'd indicated?
Yeah, just I was asked by the Secretariat of the Arts All-Party Group, of which I'm chair, just because some parties are changing their portfolios. If there's been a change in your party portfolio, would you be able to indicate if you'd like to join the Arts APG, basically? I think it was directed as well, just at yourself, because I think Carol had mentioned. So.
Yeah, I think you've been headhunted.
Yeah, absolutely, Kara. Yep, we need someone from that side of the.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that, Sian. Kelly.
Sorry, Chair. I should have maybe brought it up under the last issue in the Forward Work programme. You know, when we are talking about the other housing, there's been a fantastic piece of work is being done. Now I'm wrecking my head here because the All Party Group on construction, we're talking about this, and this is a mapping exercise that is being done across the government departments to identify where public land is available that could potentially be used for housing. It might be useful to get access to that, but I don't think it was communities that were involved in that. It may well have been infrastructure and economy, I'm going to say. I don't know whether it might be worthwhile asking the All Party Group on construction, who I think, it used to be Patsy McGlone was the chair of that, if we could have those details.
Maybe ask the clerk to seek him.
10 years ago, through the department, they brought SIB in to actually do that work. Yeah. So every year. So there was work on it, but it never actually got kind of published. So
yeah, no, and it ties in with what I thought was very interesting about what Grania finished with there, was around the idea of coming together, building the social housing, putting in the other pieces of infrastructure in a joined up way. Is really.
Chair, the problem with it is that while the government departments can identify the land that they have, nobody's asking the councils. So the LDPs, we're missing that piece. They may well have land. Now I know they're going to have to sell it at market value. Obviously they can't just gift it, but to even know what the land is would be useful. I don't know if there's some way that we can ask.
Yeah. And I thought that's what Grania was indicating, that they were trying to do a wider trawl of the other stakeholders who might have something to contribute to that land banking.
I know, Chair, that's happened in Belfast. You know, there's been the council have led an exercise, you know, in identifying housing opportunity land. It started off in the city centre and then it became citywide. You know.
Wasn't that what DOF were meant to do around the public land register?
Maybe at Andy, you're right.
DOF were doing that for several years, but have never brought it forward.
So maybe could you do a piece of
Find
work?
out where the work on that sits currently, and if there's any update for committee.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other members? Any other business? Okay, members. Then finally, and thank you. Date, time, and location of the next meeting will be at 10 a.m. on Thursday, 11th of April, here in Room 29, Parliament Buildings. The meeting is now adjourned, and we will go into closed or adjourned.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29, 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 sound.